She walked into her own wedding as if walking into an execution ground. No tears. No pleas. Only empty eyes staring straight at the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. The man who had sworn to destroy her family. The man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of all Blackwater. Ronan Vey. And tonight, she would become his weapon of revenge. But when the white silk veil fell to the floor of the penthouse overlooking the dark harbor, Ronan stood still. For on that woman's body, it wasn't beauty that silenced him, but scars. The convoy moved through Blackwater City like a blade drawn slowly across skin, precise, inevitable, and leaving nothing untouched in its wake. 3 armored SUVs cut through the rain-slicked streets of the financial district just past midnight, their headlights fracturing against wet asphalt in long, cold streaks of white. The city pressed in from every angle, glass towers bleeding light into low cloud cover, neon signs reflected and re-reflected in shallow gutters, until the whole street looked like it was burning from underneath. It was the kind of night that made Blackwater look beautiful from a distance. Up close, it smelled like diesel and old money and something rotting beneath both. Ronan Vey sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle with one hand resting on his knee and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular beyond the rain-streaked window. He was 41 years old and looked every year of it, not in the way that suggested softness or decay, but in the way that iron looks older after fire. His face was angular and composed, the kind of stillness that trained itself over decades into something that could pass for indifference. Dark suit, no tie, a scar running from the corner of his left jaw down toward his collar that he'd stopped explaining to people roughly 15 years ago. He was thinking about his brother, not the way grief usually works, not with the soft ache of missing someone. Ronan had burned that version of grief away a long time ago. What remained was something sharper and more useful, the kind of clarity that comes when you've decided something irrevocably and simply haven't finished executing it yet. Daniel had been 23. He'd been the one person Ronan had genuinely believed deserved better than the life they'd inherited. And Magnus Vale had taken that from them with the casual efficiency of a man who considered other people's sons an acceptable operating cost. Tonight was the beginning of what came after. 5 minutes, said Crane from the front passenger seat. Crane was Ronan's second, built like a warehouse door, quiet as machinery, and loyal in the way that money and shared history could occasionally produce in men who had no other talent for attachment. He didn't turn around when he spoke. He rarely did. I know, Ronan said. The wedding venue was the Vale Foundation's private events hall on the 23rd floor of the Meridian Tower, a building Magnus Vale had donated to the city with considerable fanfare 7 years ago, the kind of civic gesture designed to generate goodwill and deflect scrutiny in equal measure. Ronan had approved the location specifically. He wanted the marriage to happen in something Magnus had built. He wanted to watch the man's face when his daughter walked out of it wearing another man's name. He had not thought much about the daughter. He knew the broad strokes. Selene Vale, 28, rarely photographed at public events, reportedly abroad for extended periods over the past several years. Her absence from the social pages of Blackwater's elite had been explained variously as illness, artistic pursuits, and personal preference. Ronan's people had pulled her file 3 weeks ago when the arrangement was first proposed by intermediaries on Magnus's side. A peace offering dressed up in the language of alliance, a gesture of good faith that Magnus presented with the sincerity of a man who had been very carefully briefed on exactly how much danger he was in. The file had been thin. Recent photographs, thinner still. The ones that existed showed a woman with dark hair and an expression that the camera seemed to struggle to catch directly, like she was perpetually in the process of looking somewhere else. Ronan had studied those photographs for approximately 40 seconds and then set them aside. She was a means to an end. She was Magnus Vale's blood, and that made her useful. Nothing in his understanding of the situation required him to think beyond that. The elevator doors opened onto the 23rd floor to the low murmur of assembled guests. 50 people, all carefully selected, all present because refusing an invitation to a Vey event in Blackwater City had ceased to be a practical option roughly a decade ago. Ronan moved through the room with the ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most dangerous person in any space he occupied. People stepped aside without being asked. Conversations faltered and resumed at lower volumes. He recognized faces, politicians, businessmen, 2 federal judges whose cooperation had been secured through channels that would never appear in any official record. He acknowledged none of them. Magnus Vale was standing near the bar. He was 63 years old and wore it the way men with significant resources sometimes managed. Not gracefully, but expensively. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the careful smile of a man who had practiced it so long, it had calcified into something that no longer required conscious effort. He was surrounded by 3 of his own people, positioned with the casual proximity of bodyguards pretending to be guests. And he held a glass of something amber-colored that he brought to his lips when he saw Ronan without breaking eye contact. A message. "I'm not afraid of you here." Ronan crossed the room slowly. He stopped 4 feet from Magnus and said nothing for a moment, letting the silence do the work it was designed to do. "Ronan." Magnus's voice was measured, warm, even, the voice of a man addressing a business partner at a routine function. "I'm glad you're here. Are you? This is a good thing for both our families." Magnus tilted the glass slightly. "I hope you'll come to see it that way." "I already see it exactly as it is," Ronan said. "Where is she?" Something crossed Magnus's face that disappeared before it fully formed. "She'll be down shortly. She was particular about the preparation." "I'll bet." He moved away from Magnus before the conversation could develop into anything that required him to maintain civility for longer than he was currently equipped to manage. Crane appeared at his elbow with a low murmur. Security check confirmed, no weapons beyond their own detail. The officiant was in position, 40 minutes until the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Ronan nodded and accepted a glass of water from a passing server and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city laid out below him in its rain-smeared expanse of light and dark. He was thinking about the moment, 7 years ago, when he had identified the man responsible for Daniel's death. The months of verification that followed, the night he had finally been certain, the decision he had made then, and every decision since, forming a chain of consequence that had led him here, to this room, on this night, in this suit, about to marry a woman he had never spoken a word to. He was not a man who doubted his choices, but there was a particular quality to the silence inside him tonight that he chose not to examine too closely. He heard the room shift before he turned around. She came in from the side entrance rather than the formal doorway, which he noted with professional attention. The dress was white silk with a high neckline and long sleeves, unusual for a summer wedding, though it was raining hard enough outside that the temperature had dropped sharply. Her dark hair was arranged simply, no elaborate construction. She wore no jewelry except small earrings. She was moving at the pace of someone conserving energy rather than making an entrance, each step deliberate and controlled and utterly devoid of the performance that occasions like this generally extracted from people. She was not looking at him. She was scanning the room. Ronan recognized that behavior because he did it himself. The rapid, systematic cataloging of exits and threats that becomes reflexive in people who have spent serious time in dangerous environments. It was not the behavior of a sheltered billionaire's daughter at her own wedding reception. He filed that. Their eyes met when she was approximately 10 feet away. She stopped moving for just under 1 second, a pause so brief most people in the room would not have registered it, and then continued toward him. Up close, she was something he hadn't quite anticipated. Not beautiful in the formal, curated way that money tended to produce, but arresting in the way that exhaustion and control combined sometimes created something stranger and more compelling. Her eyes were the color of deep water in winter. They looked at him with an assessment that was almost clinical. "You're Ronan Vey," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Selene Vale." She said her own name the way you might read an entry off a legal document, without warmth or bitterness, simply declarative. "I know." "Then we've covered the introduction." She looked past him briefly toward her father across the room, and something in the set of her jaw changed in a way that was there and gone so quickly he almost missed it. Almost. "Shall we get this over with?" Again, not a question. The ceremony was short and felt shorter. The officiant moved through the language of it with professional efficiency, and Ronan responded to each prompt with the minimal syllable required. Selene's voice was steady throughout. She did not look at him when she spoke the words. She looked at a point approximately 2 feet above and to the left of his shoulder, which Ronan recognized as the focusing technique of someone managing an intense physical or emotional state without external expression. When the ring was placed on her finger, A simple band, nothing theatrical, Ronan had refused to perform sentimentality even in symbol. Her hand was completely still. No tremor. No involuntary tension. The stillness of a person who had learned that stillness was safer than reaction. The reception was where things began to deteriorate. It was Ronan who engineered the first humiliation, and he did it with the cold precision of a man executing a plan he'd considered from every angle. During the toast, when attention was on them, he introduced her to the assembled room not by name, but by lineage. Vale's daughter, he said, twice, emphasizing the possessive, the belonging, the reduction of her identity to her paternity. He watched Magnus's face as he said it, and saw the tight-jawed pride that flickered through the older man's expression, and beneath that, something else, something that looked almost like relief. He watched Selene's face through this and found nothing. That was the first thing that genuinely unsettled him. He had performed these exercises of dominance before. In his world, power was communicated through precisely calibrated humiliations. Who sat where, who spoke when, whose name preceded whose in any public statement. The people on the receiving end of these gestures invariably registered them. A flush of anger, a visible swallow, a flickering of the eyes that betrayed the effort of self-control. It was the registration that mattered, not the humiliation itself. The message required a receiver. Selene received nothing. Or if she did, she had built something in front of it that absorbed the signal entirely and returned only a smooth and impenetrable surface. He tried again, later, during dinner. A comment about her father's business acumen delivered with the particular inflection that made it clear the compliment was inverted. A casual physical proximity during the photographs that was designed to communicate ownership rather than affection. A remark to one of his captains, made within her earshot, about the practical utility of political marriages. Nothing. She ate her dinner. She answered questions from guests with brief and accurate courtesy. She held a glass of wine she barely drank. She sat beside him for 3 hours in a room full of dangerous people and never once looked like any of it was costing her anything. By midnight, Ronan was experiencing something he had not felt in a long time. Curiosity. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Meridian Tower and had been prepared for the night per arrangements Ronan's people had made. Cleared of non-essential staff, secured perimeter, 1 guard rotation every 40 minutes on the residential floor below. The living space was enormous and cold in the way that very expensive rooms often were. Beautiful surfaces, no warmth, the feeling of inhabiting a catalog image rather than a place anyone actually lived. Selene stood at the window looking at the harbor for several minutes after they arrived. Ronan removed his jacket and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't particularly want and watched her from across the room. "You can drop the performance," he said finally. She turned from the window. "Which one?" That surprised him enough that he didn't answer immediately. "The composure," he said. "You don't have to maintain it up here. There's no audience." She looked at him for a moment. "You think I was performing? I think you were managing an audience." "Yes," she said, simply, without defensiveness. "So were you." He set the glass down. "This marriage is a transaction. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand it. Your father made an arrangement. You're the instrument of that arrangement. I'm not interested in—" He stopped. "In what?" "In pretending it's anything else." Selene moved away from the window toward the center of the room. Her walk was the same as it had been all evening, controlled, deliberate, preserving something. She stopped and looked at him with those deep-water eyes and said, "Did he tell you why he offered me? Specifically?" "He said you were his only heir." "He told you what it would cost him," she said. "He didn't tell you what it cost me." "Frankly, I know. You don't care." She said it without heat. "That's fine. I'm not asking you to." She turned toward the bedroom doorway and then paused with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "I'm going to change out of this dress. Whatever you've decided tonight looks like. I won't fight you. I stopped fighting a long time ago." There was something in the way she said that last sentence. The flatness of it, the complete and utter absence of self-pity, just a statement of fact delivered like a weather report, that made Ronan Vey stand very still in the middle of that cold, expensive room for a long moment after she disappeared through the door. He finished his whiskey. He waited 10 minutes, which was not something he typically did. Then he walked to the bedroom doorway. She was standing near the foot of the bed with her back to him, and she had gotten the zipper of the dress halfway down before stopping. Not frozen in distress, as far as he could tell. Just stopped. The back of the dress gaped open from the nape of her neck to the middle of her spine, and in the low light coming from the bedside lamp he could see. He went very still. His eyes moved across what the light revealed, and the part of his mind that processed violence and its evidence, the part he'd been using professionally since he was 19 years old, the part that could read a wound the way other men read text, cataloged what he was seeing with the rapid, involuntary precision of long practice. A burn scar, old, well-healed, running in a deliberate line across her left shoulder blade. Not accidental. The shape was too controlled, the margin too consistent. Surgical application of heat to soft tissue. Below it, and only partially visible, the faded pale silver tracks of lash marks, multiple, parallel, covering a wide section of her lower back. Old, years old, overlapping in places that indicated repeated injury. And across her ribs, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what he was looking at, the specific thickened texture of scar tissue left by bladed instruments in the hands of someone who knew how to hurt without killing. Ronan had seen torture. He had been in rooms where it happened, and rooms where it had recently finished happening, and rooms where the evidence of it had been carefully cleaned up, but not carefully enough. He knew the difference between the body's record of accidents and the body's record of deliberate, sustained, methodical harm inflicted by someone with knowledge and time and the specific intent to cause maximum damage without fatality. This was the second. He had not moved and had not spoken, and the silence stretched long enough that she turned around. She looked at his face and read it, whatever she found there, and something in her expression shifted, barely perceptibly, into something that might have been resignation or might have been relief. She didn't reach for the fabric. She didn't cover herself. She stood there in the half-open dress and the low light and let him look at her the way you let someone look at evidence. "Selene, don't." Her voice was quiet, not sharp, just preventive, like she was stopping him from saying something that would require her to respond to, and she didn't have the capacity for that particular conversation tonight. He didn't move. "How long?" She was quiet for a moment. "Which part?" The specific weight of that answer, which part, landed on him in a way that required him to do something he almost never did in conversation, which was recalibrate entirely mid-sentence. "The oldest ones," he said. 14. She said it the same way she'd said everything else tonight. Flat, factual, no request for sympathy embedded in the delivery. He was 41 years old, and he had done things that would not survive examination, and he was not a man who carried much in the way of conscience about most of them. But there was something happening inside his chest at this moment that he did not have immediate language for, and its unfamiliarity made him focus outward rather than inward, which was the only direction he was equipped to move. "Your father," he said, not a question. He already knew. The knowledge arrived fully formed, assembled from the evidence his eyes had gathered and the way she'd scanned the room when she'd entered and the specific way her jaw had moved when she'd seen Magnus across the reception hall and the words she'd said, "I stopped fighting a long time ago." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she said the thing that would stay with him through every decision he made from this point forward, the thing that reordered the entire architecture of his understanding of this night and what it was and what she was and what he was now, without having chosen to be involved in. "My father hurt me long before he ever hurt you." The rain hit the penthouse windows. The harbor lights blurred and spread in the downpour. Ronan Vey stood in the bedroom doorway of his own penthouse on his own wedding night, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he had absolutely no idea what he was going to do next. He knew only one thing with any certainty. Magnus Vale had come to him with an offering, a gesture of submission, a daughter handed across like property to settle a debt. What Magnus Vale had actually done, whether he understood it or not, was place inside Ronan's household, inside Ronan's direct and daily proximity, the one person alive who knew every crime Magnus had committed and had survived the cost of that knowledge. And Ronan was beginning to understand, in the slowly clarifying way of a man whose instincts were rarely wrong and whose instincts right now were screaming, that Selene Vale had not been offered. She had positioned herself. He looked at her for a long moment in the low light, Close the door, he said. I'll take the other room. She blinked. One slow blink of something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it, a fractional recalibration behind those winter-dark eyes. And then she nodded once and reached for the door. Selene, she paused. We're going to talk tomorrow. He held her gaze. All of it, everything, from the beginning. She looked at him for a moment, the look of a person who has spent a very long time not trusting anybody deciding, in real time, whether to begin. Okay, she said. The door closed between them. Ronan sat down heavily in an armchair in the outer room and stared at the harbor through the rain-hammered glass and turned over in his mind the image of what he had seen, and the specific cold fury that was beginning to assemble itself in his chest was different from anything he had felt in years, different from the focused, functional anger of his professional life, different from the long-burning grief rage of what had happened to Daniel. It was something closer to recognition. He thought about Magnus Vale raising his glass at the bar and smiling with that calcified smile. He thought about Selene at 14. He thought about how many years stood between those two things. He was still sitting there when the first pale light came up over the harbor, and the rain finally began to slow, and he had not slept, and he was not tired, and he had made, in the long, still hours of that first night, a decision that had nothing to do with the transaction he had entered this marriage believing it to be. Somewhere in the East Wing, he heard her moving, a quiet step, then stillness, then another step. And he understood, without needing to see it, that she hadn't slept either. There were things she was carrying that she had never been allowed to set down, and there were things Ronan Vey now knew that Magnus Vale did not yet know he knew. In Blackwater City, information was the most dangerous currency there was. And tonight, without meaning to, without asking, Magnus Vale had handed Ronan the one piece of information capable of changing everything. Not the debt, not the alliance, not the political leverage a marriage between their names might generate. He had handed him a witness. What Ronan didn't know yet, couldn't know, sitting in that cold, expensive room in the gray hour before dawn, was that witness had been waiting years to be found, that there were recordings, that there were files, that the woman on the other side of that door had not come to him empty-handed, that what looked like a surrender was the opening move of the most carefully planned thing he had ever encountered. He would find that out tomorrow. What he didn't know was that tomorrow, 2 of his warehouses in the Southport district would be burning before noon, and the message left at the scene would be written in Magnus Vale's specific and unmistakable hand. The war, it turned out, had already started. It just hadn't been introduced to all its participants yet. The warehouses burned for 6 hours. Ronan stood on the roof of the Vey Logistics building on Crane Street and watched the Southport district glow against the low morning clouds. 2 columns of black smoke rising in parallel against a sky the color of a bruise. His phone had woken him at 6:47 a.m. He hadn't been asleep. With Crane's voice delivering the information in the flat, sequential manner of a man reporting operational damage. Warehouse 9 and Warehouse 12, Southport, accelerant fire, total structural loss. 3 night shift workers evacuated. 1 hospitalized with smoke inhalation. No fatalities. The message left at the scene was 7 words written on a piece of Vale Foundation letterhead slid under the door of the site manager's office before the fire started. You should have taken the deal you were offered. Ronan had read the photograph of it on his phone screen for approximately 15 seconds. Then he had gotten dressed, told Crane to pull every man off non-essential rotations, and left the penthouse without looking at the door that separated him from the East Wing bedroom, where Selene Vey now, legally, as of 11 hours ago, had presumably spent the night in the same quality of sleeplessness he had. He would deal with that when he came back. If he came back at the same temperature he left, which was not guaranteed. The port fires were a message, and the message was constructed with a specific psychological intelligence that Ronan respected even as it enraged him. Magnus hadn't hit a weapons cache or a money operation or anything that would constitute real operational damage. He'd burned storage, replaceable product, insurable loss, visible smoke. The point wasn't destruction. The point was visibility. Magnus wanted the rest of the city, the other families, the political contacts, the federal observers already circling, to see smoke rising from Ronan Vey's territory on the morning after his wedding and draw their own conclusions about who was actually in control of the terms of this arrangement. It was a smart move, Ronan hated that it was a smart move. "How long before the insurance adjusters arrive?" he asked, without looking away from the smoke. 2 hours, Crane said from behind him. Castellano called. He wants a meeting. Frank Castellano ran the West Side operation. Oldest captain in Ronan's network, 60 years old, had served Ronan's father before serving Ronan, and possessed the specific quality of loyalty that came with age and a lack of better options. He also possessed the specific quality of an old man who believed that chaos was always someone's fault, and that fault should be assigned and punished on a timeline that preceded full information. "Tell him this afternoon, 4 o'clock. Ronan turned from the edge of the roof. "Who else?" "Devereaux is asking questions. Sent a proxy." Crane's voice didn't change. It never did. "The Solis people have gone quiet, which is worse." "It is worse." Ronan moved toward the roof access door. "And the federal surveillance?" "Increased. 2 vehicles in the Southport district since 6 a.m. They're not hiding it." Ronan stopped at the door and looked back at the smoke one more time. The second column was taller than the first now, darker, folding into itself in the wind off the harbor. 40 years ago, his father had built those warehouses with money that came from people who no longer existed in any documentable form. They had been functional, profitable, and aggressively unremarkable. They were now a signal fire visible from half the city. "Get me everything we have on the Vale Logistics Network," he said. "Not the legitimate side. The shipping routes, the ones that don't appear in any filing." Crane was quiet for one beat. "That's going to require reaching into some complicated places." "I know what it requires." Ronan pulled the door open. "Do it." He was back at the penthouse by 9. She was in the kitchen. This was not what he expected, though he couldn't have articulated precisely what he had expected. Something more fortress-like, perhaps, more barricaded. Instead, she was standing at the kitchen counter in the kind of plain dark clothing that suggested she'd packed a bag for this, with the specific practicality of someone who didn't intend to dress for anyone's benefit, and she was making coffee with the focused attention of a person performing a familiar task in an unfamiliar environment. There was a legal pad on the counter beside the coffee maker. She had been writing on it. She looked up when he came in, read his face in approximately 2 seconds. "How bad?" she said. 2 warehouses, Southport." He used the foundation letterhead. It wasn't a question. Ronan stopped moving. "How do you know that?" "Because that's what he does when he wants to make sure you know it was him, but can't prove it formally." She poured coffee into a mug and didn't offer him any, which he noted without commentary. He did it to a man named Petrov in 2019. Before that, a logistics broker in the harbor district named Wells. He burned their storage and left foundation letterhead. Both men withdrew from whatever position they'd taken against him within 3 weeks. Ronan pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. "And what happened to Petrov and Wells after they withdrew?" She picked up the mug and looked at him over the rim. "Petrov disappeared in 2021. Wells had a car accident 14 months after the fire. His wife collected the insurance. So compliance didn't save them." "Compliance never saves anyone he's decided to remove. It just changes the timeline." She set the mug down and turned the legal pad toward him. He looked at it. It was covered in handwriting, small, dense, organized in a structure that was somewhere between a timeline and a diagram. Names, dates, locations, numbers that appeared to be coordinates or routing codes, lines drawn between entries with arrows indicating directionality. He looked up at her. "You've been awake all night," he said. "Yes, writing this." "I've had it in my head for years," she said. "I was waiting for somewhere to put it." He pulled the legal pad toward him and began reading. The room was quiet except for the rain that had resumed against the windows, softer now than last night, more persistent. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. She didn't move, didn't offer explanation, let the document communicate for itself. When he looked up, his expression had changed in a way that she apparently read accurately, because something in her posture shifted slightly. Not relaxation exactly, but a fractional reduction in the specific tension of someone who has been waiting to find out whether what they've handed over will be believed or dismissed. "These routing codes," he said, "container shipments, moving through the legitimate Vale import infrastructure, but flagged internally with a secondary classification system he developed about 12 years ago." "What are they moving?" "People, mostly. Not always. The codes differentiate by cargo type. The ones beginning with V7 are human trafficking routes. The ones with M series prefixes are contraband, weapons, mostly precursor chemicals in the last 3 years. And you have documentation of this. Her eyes held his. I have recordings, digital files, physical documents I removed from his estate over a period of about 2 years before I was no longer able to access them. Where? Somewhere he can't reach. She picked up the mug again. Somewhere you can't reach either, yet. The last word was doing specific work, and they both knew it. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. You came into this marriage with leverage, he said. I came into this marriage with evidence, she said. That's different. Explain the difference. Leverage is something you hold over someone to make them do what you want. She set the mug down with a precise, quiet click. Evidence is something you've spent 14 years collecting because you intend to destroy someone with it, and you needed to make sure when you finally moved, they couldn't come back from it. The rain ran down the windows. You planned this, Ronan said. I waited for the right conditions. She met his gaze without flinching. You're the right conditions. He stood up from the stool and walked to the window with the legal pad still in his hand. He was processing, running the architecture of what she'd told him against the structure of what he already knew, looking for the seams, the places where her account didn't hold, the angles from which this could still be a construction designed to manipulate his movement against Magnus in a direction that served Magnus's interest. He couldn't find them, which meant either she was telling the truth or she was extraordinarily good, and given the specific quality of composure she had demonstrated over the past 12 hours, he could not rule out the latter. I'm going to need to verify everything on this list independently, he said. I expected that. And I'm going to need to know exactly where the recordings are. I expected that too. She watched his back. I'll tell you when I'm ready to tell you. He turned around. That's not how this works. Then we have a problem, she said, with a complete absence of drama. Because I've handed my life to you based on approximately 12 hours of acquaintance, and I have no particular reason to believe you won't take everything I've given you, use it to destroy my father, and then decide I'm a liability. The words hit with the precision of someone who had spent a long time in confined spaces with nothing to do but think, and the particular accuracy of them, the fact that the scenario she was describing was not one he could honestly tell her was impossible, kept him from answering immediately. You're right, he said finally. You don't have a reason to trust me. No. So we need to build one. She looked at him. That takes time. We have time. He set the legal pad on the counter. We don't have much else right now, but we have that. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that silence, he could feel her running the same calculation he was running, looking for the trap, the angle, the thing beneath the statement that made it dangerous. He let her look. He had nothing to hide in this particular moment, which was itself unusual enough that he wasn't sure what to do with it. He's going to escalate, she said. The warehouses were the first move. I know. He has people inside your organization. She said it flatly, without softening. At least 2, possibly 3. I don't know their names, but I know they exist because I heard him confirm it to someone on the phone approximately 8 months ago. That's why the fire happened on the night of the wedding. He needed to demonstrate to them that he had reach inside your operation before they could be fully transitioned under your control. Ronan went very still. He needed to demonstrate it to them, Ronan repeated slowly. The men who were watching the warehouses last night, she said. They weren't there to start the fire. They were there to see that it happened, to confirm that the access was real. The implication of this, the specific operational implication, settled on him with the weight of something that had been true before he understood it and would continue being true regardless of whether he could immediately act on it. Someone in his network had given Magnus the timing, the location, the shift schedule. Someone who was now watching to see what he did next. He crossed to the kitchen counter and picked up his phone and dialed. Crane. His voice was level. The 3 men on night rotation at the Southport facilities. Pull their communications records from the last 2 weeks. Do it quietly. Don't tell anyone you're doing it. He paused. And reschedule Castellano to tomorrow. I need today. He ended the call and stood with the phone in his hand and the weight of the morning sitting on him like wet concrete. You could have told me this last night, he said. Last night you were deciding whether I was an asset or a problem. She looked at him steadily. I needed to see which one you landed on before I told you anything that mattered. And now you know. Now I have a better guess. She pulled the legal pad back toward her and turned to a fresh page. There's more. I'll tell you in order. It's easier to understand in order. She told him for 3 hours. He didn't interrupt often, and when he did, it was to ask specific questions, dates, names, the precise language of recorded conversations she was paraphrasing from memory. Her memory was extraordinary. Not the performative memory of someone reciting prepared material, but the specific granular recall of someone who had spent years in isolation with nothing to anchor themselves to except the details of what had been done to them, and by whom, and when, and in front of which witnesses. She described the estate where she'd been held, a property Magnus owned through 3 layers of corporate structure off the coast of a state that didn't ask questions about what wealthy men did on private land. She described the medical staff he'd employed to manage the psychological deterioration of a woman who knew too much and refused to break. She described the 2 attempts she'd made to contact the outside world, and what had happened after each one, which she delivered in the same even tone she'd used to describe everything else, and which cost him something to hear delivered in that tone, in the daylight, in a kitchen in his apartment in a city that had been doing business with the man responsible for all of it. She described the moment she'd understood that direct resistance was a losing strategy, the slow construction of a different approach, compliance as cover, patience as weapon, the gradual accumulation of evidence over years of careful, invisible work, while Magnus believed he had successfully broken her. He thought I was managed, she said. He thought the estate had done what it was supposed to do. That's why he offered the marriage. In his mind, he was using a damaged asset to buy peace with you. He wasn't afraid of what I might tell you because he didn't believe I had the capacity left to tell anyone anything coherent. He underestimated you. He needed to underestimate me, she said. I worked very hard to make sure he did. Ronan looked at her. This woman sitting across from him at his kitchen counter with dark circles under her eyes, and a coffee mug that had been empty for an hour, and a legal pad full of evidence that could bring down a significant portion of Blackwater City's power structure, and felt something move in him that he chose not to identify and put immediately aside for the moment. The recordings, he said, are they clean? Legally usable? Some of them. She turned the legal pad back to the front page and tapped one of the entries. These 3 specifically, made in contexts that establish admissibility. I had help, years ago, from someone who understood evidentiary requirements. Who? A lawyer who no longer practices because my father ended his career after discovering the consultation. She looked at him. He's alive. He's in Blackwater. He doesn't know the recordings still exist. He will soon. Yes. She held his gaze. So will my father, if your network has the holes I think it does. It took Crane until 6 that evening to identify the first name. His name was Bartel, mid-level logistics coordinator, 7 years in Ronan's network, unremarkable performance record, no prior flags. His communications showed 3 encrypted exchanges with a number that traced back through 4 relays to a device registered in the Vale corporate infrastructure. The most recent exchange had occurred at 11:34 p.m. the previous night, 40 minutes before the fire started. Ronan received this information in the main room of the penthouse, while Selene sat at the far end of the couch reading through printed documents his research team had begun pulling on the Vale shipping network. She didn't look up when Crane delivered the report. She had been quiet for the past 2 hours, working through the pages with the focused patience of someone doing a job they'd been preparing to do for a very long time. Ronan looked at the name on the page and then looked at Crane. The other 2. Still working? Work faster. He set the page down. And bring Bartel in, quietly, tonight. Crane left. Ronan stood at the window with the harbor below him going dark as the evening came in and the rain finally, after 30-some hours, began to ease. The light over the water was gray gold and cold and beautiful in the disinterested way of things that had no opinion about what happened beneath them. Castellano called it 7. Ronan let it go to voicemail the first time. When it came again 4 minutes later, he answered. Frank, I'm hearing things. Castellano's voice was the voice of a 60-year-old man who had spent 40 years being afraid of the wrong things. and had developed a finely tuned sense for when the wrong things had been replaced by correctly identified ones. I'm hearing about Southport. I'm hearing about the federal vehicles. I'm hearing about the Vale girl being in your house. She's my wife, Frank. She's Magnus Vale's daughter in your house. Castellano's voice dropped. I need to know you understand what that is. Tell me what you think it is. I think it's a snake in the nest, Ronan. I think it's the oldest play in the book. You marry the enemy's child, you let her walk around inside your operation for 6 months, and then she's not walking around inside anything. Ronan's voice was controlled. She's sitting in my living room reading documents about her father's shipping network that she provided voluntarily. Silence on the line. She provided them, Castellano said. Yes, and you believe them. I'm verifying them. Ronan kept his voice level, which is what I do before I believe anything. And if they're real? If they're real, Frank, then Magnus Vale has been running a trafficking operation through legitimate import infrastructure for over a decade, and we've been doing business in the same port district without knowing it, which makes us adjacent to something we can't afford to be adjacent to when the federal pressure increases. Another silence. Longer this time. How certain are you? Castellano said. Certain enough to have pulled a man tonight. The silence that followed this had a particular texture, the texture of an old man recalibrating, updating a model he'd been running for a long time against information that changed its parameters significantly. What do you need? Castellano said finally. Your people in the harbor district. Anyone who's seen unusual movement through the Vale freight channels in the last 18 months. Not reports. Conversations. I want what people noticed but didn't say out loud. I'll make calls tonight. Good. Ronan paused. And Frank, this conversation stays in this conversation. Of course. He ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in his hand and the city darkening outside and the quiet of the penthouse around him. Then he turned. Selene was looking at him. She had a printed shipping manifest in her hand, and she was looking at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, or beginning to believe he could read, which was not quite the same thing, but was closer than it had been this morning. She had the look of someone who had heard enough of a conversation to understand its shape without requiring the specifics. Your captains are going to be a problem, she said. Some of them. Castellano just adjusted. For now. Ronan sat down in the chair across from her. The ones who don't adjust are the ones I'm worried about. She looked at the manifest in her hand. There are 3 more names in here, men who appear in the internal Vale documentation as, she paused, as having facilitated specific shipments in exchange for cash payments through a blind corporate account. Give me the names. She did. 2 of them Ronan knew. He didn't let what passed through him in that moment reach his face, but it cost him something to manage it, and she watched him do it with the careful attention of someone who had spent years reading men's faces for the information their voices didn't carry. How long have you known those names? He said. I've had them for approximately 3 years. She held his gaze. I didn't know they were in your network specifically. I knew they were in someone's network. I knew they were in Blackwater. I didn't know whose. And now you know whose. Yes. She set the manifest down. I'm sorry. She said it simply and without performance. Not an apology for knowing, an acknowledgement of what knowing cost. He was quiet for a long moment. It's better to know, he said. It usually is. Her voice was even. It doesn't feel that way. No, he said. It doesn't. They ate dinner in a silence that wasn't hostile, a different kind of quiet than the previous night, less armored, more exhausted. She made something from ingredients in his largely decorative kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to cook in circumstances where resources were limited and self-sufficiency was not optional. He ate it without commentary, and she didn't ask for any. Afterward, she went back to the documents, and he went back to his phone, and the night came fully down over the harbor, and neither of them mentioned the fact that they had spent approximately 14 hours in each other's company and had covered more ground than most people covered in months, and that the ground they had covered was almost exclusively the territory of catastrophe and betrayal and methodical, years-long survival. At some point around 11, she fell asleep on the couch. Not intentionally, he could tell from the way she went down, the document still in her hand, her body making the decision before her mind got a vote. The paper slipped from her fingers, and she was asleep before it hit the cushion. Ronan watched her for a moment. The set of her face in sleep was different from her waking face. Not softer exactly, but less managed. The constant low-level vigilance she maintained, the absolute monitoring of every expression, had gone offline temporarily, and what remained was something that looked younger and more battered and more real than anything she'd shown him during the day. He picked up the document she'd dropped, set it on the table, and placed a blanket from the back of the couch over her with the careful movements of someone handling something that could startle. Then he went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed with his phone and the notes he'd been making all day and spent 2 hours doing what he always did when he was in the middle of something, building the full picture, every element mapped against every other element, looking for the move that Magnus would make next, and working backward from that to what Ronan needed to do before it arrived, the move Magnus would make next. He turned it over. The warehouses had been visibility, proof of access, message to the other families, pressure on Ronan to demonstrate a response. The next move would be escalation, but of a different kind. Magnus would need to neutralize the information risk now that Selene was inside Ronan's perimeter and presumably talking. He would need to discredit her, or remove Ronan first. What was Magnus's fastest path to any of those three? The names Selene had given him. The men inside his network. Ronan looked at the ceiling, not the men themselves. They were already identified, already watched, already going to be addressed before they could act. But what those men represented? The knowledge that Ronan's organization was not sealed. That information moved through it in directions Ronan didn't fully control yet. That meant Magnus would be receiving updates. Which meant Magnus already knew about the morning's conversation, probably knew about the legal pad, possibly knew about the shipping manifests. Which meant Magnus knew that the evidence existed and that Selene had transferred it. Ronan sat with that for a long moment. If Magnus knew the evidence was now in Ronan's hands, the calculation changed dramatically. The window to act on that evidence, to use it in a controlled way, at a time of their choosing, was narrowing in real time. Magnus would move to preempt it, aggressively, probably publicly. His phone buzzed. The message was from a number he didn't recognize. She has recordings. You don't know where they are. Neither do I. But I know who she gave them to for safekeeping. His name is Harlan Voss. He lives at 44 Pelham Court. Find him before my father does. Ronan read it twice. He looked at the door to the living room. He got up, crossed to the couch, and stood over the sleeping woman for a moment. Then he crouched down to her eye level and said her name quietly. She was awake in under 2 seconds. The speed of it confirmed everything he'd suspected about the quality of her sleep over the past several years. That it had never been safe enough to go all the way down, that some part of her had remained on watch regardless of consciousness. "What happened?" she said. No confusion, no disorientation, immediately present. He held out the phone so she could read the message. Her face did something complicated in the space of about 3 seconds. Recognition, calculation, a flash of something that might have been fear before control reasserted itself. "Who is Harlan Voss?" Ronan said. She looked at him. Her eyes were very dark in the low light. "He's the lawyer," she said. "The one who helped me understand how to make the recordings admissible. He has them. He has copies." She sat up. "The originals are somewhere else. Someone is telling us to find him first." Ronan's voice was steady, which means someone knows your father is already moving toward him. She was already on her feet. "Then we need to go," she said. "Right now." Ronan stood and looked at her. This woman who had been asleep 4 minutes ago and was now standing in the low light of his living room with her jaw set and her eyes clear and everything about her posture communicating the specific readiness of someone who had been waiting for this particular moment for a long, long time. He picked up his jacket from the chair. "Stay close," he said. "Always," she said. And the word came out with a weight that had nothing to do with the instruction and everything to do with the 14 years it had taken her to get here. To this room, to this moment, to the threshold of something she had planned for so long it had become indistinguishable from survival itself. They were already moving toward the door when his phone buzzed a second time. The message was a single line from Crane. "Bartell is dead. Found in the South Port District. Someone got to him first." Ronan read it as they stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind them. The penthouse receded above. The city waited below. Someone was cleaning house, and they were already... The elevator dropped 17 floors in 11 seconds, and Ronan spent every one of them looking at the second message on his phone screen. Bartell was dead. Not disappeared, not warned off. Dead. In the Southport district, which meant within 3 blocks of the warehouses that had burned that morning, which meant Magnus had left him there deliberately, close enough to the message site that the geography itself became part of the communication. Ronan had pulled Bartell for questioning at 6 in the evening. Bartell was dead by the time Crane found him, which put the window somewhere between 6 and 11 p.m., somewhere in the hours when Ronan had been sitting in his penthouse eating dinner and reading documents, and believing he was moving faster than the man he was moving against. He hadn't been moving faster. The elevator opened into the parking structure, and he was already on the phone to Crane before the doors fully separated. Who found him? Patrol car. Anonymous tip called it in. Crane's voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he understood the full weight of. He'd been there a few hours. Medical examiner says preliminary cause is a single shot, close range, execution style. Someone who knew we'd pulled him. Has to be. The other 2 names. Ronan moved toward the vehicle with Selene matching his pace beside him. She didn't ask questions. She listened to his half of the conversation with the specific attention of someone who knew how to extract full information from partial data. Are they in the building? Reyes went off grid 2 hours ago. Marchetti is at home. We have eyes on him. Don't touch Marchetti yet. I want him where I can see him. Ronan reached the car, pulled open the passenger door for Selene, rounded to the driver's side himself. Crane would object to him driving without the detail, and he didn't care. Send 2 men to 44 Pelham Court right now, quietly. They wait outside and they call me the moment anyone approaches the building. Who are we protecting at 44 Pelham? A lawyer named Harlan Voss. Don't knock on his door yet. Just eyes on the building. He started the car. Selene had her hands in her lap and was looking straight through the windshield at the parking structure's concrete columns moving past as he pulled out. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was controlled and deliberate. The kind of breathing you chose consciously rather than the kind that happened to you. Tell me about Voss, he said. Everything. Now. She started talking. Harlan Voss had been a mid-level maritime attorney working in Blackwater's harbor district when Selene had first contacted him 7 years ago through a method she'd describe later. He specialized in shipping contracts and port authority disputes, which meant he understood the specific legal architecture of the documentation she'd been accumulating. More importantly, he understood evidentiary procedure well enough to advise her on how to make the recording she was planning legally viable rather than inadmissible garbage. He had taken 3 meetings with her before Magnus identified the contact. After the 3rd meeting, Magnus had moved against him through professional channels. A series of complaints filed with the Bar Association, a client dispute orchestrated through a Vale subsidiary, a document leak that implicated Voss in a billing irregularity that was clean enough to be deniable but dirty enough to be career-ending. Voss had surrendered his license 18 months after the 3rd meeting and retreated from public life. He doesn't know I'm still active, she said. He believed I was contained. After the estate, after the years with no contact, he assumed I was either dead or permanently incapacitated. He has no reason to know the recordings exist in usable form. But he has copies. 2 USB drives, sealed in a document case in his home office. He thinks they're inert, that the original plan died when I went dark. She turned to look at Ronan directly. He kept them anyway. That's who he is. Loyal. Careful, she said. He's a careful man. He kept them because destroying evidence felt worse to him than storing it, even evidence he believed would never be used. Who sent that message? Ronan said. The unknown number. She was quiet for 2 seconds. I don't know. Guess. Someone inside my father's operation who wants him stopped. She turned back to the windshield. Or someone inside your operation who knows more about my father's operation than they've told you. She paused. Or both. Both would mean a double. Yes. Her voice didn't waver. It would. He drove. The city moved past them. The industrial harbor district transitioning to the older residential grid of the inner neighborhoods. The streets narrower here and darker. The buildings lower and closer to the road. Pelham Court was 3 minutes out. His phone buzzed on the console. He glanced at the screen. Crane. Text message. Eyes on Pelham. One vehicle parked outside 44 when we arrived. Already there, engine still warm. Ronan felt the cold settle into his chest. Someone's already at Voss, he said. She didn't make a sound, but he saw her right hand close in her lap, fingers curling inward, and he understood that for all the control she maintained over her expression and her voice, her hands sometimes told the truth independently. He pressed the accelerator. Pelham Court was a narrow residential street in the old Maritime Quarter, a block of attached townhouses built in the 1940s. Well-maintained, the kind of neighborhood that housed retired professionals and people who valued anonymity over amenity. Number 44 was mid-block, 3 steps up from street level, a dark green door under a small overhang. The Vey vehicle was parked at the corner. The unknown car, gray, angled in front of the building, engine cooling, sat 40 feet from the entrance. Ronan pulled over a block back. He looked at Selene. "You stay in this car." "No." "Selene, if he sees you first, he'll panic. He doesn't know you. He knows me." She was already reaching for the door handle. "I'm faster than you in that room." He didn't like it, but she was right. And they both knew she was right, and the 3 seconds it would take to argue the point were 3 seconds they didn't currently own. So he got out of the car and she got out of the car, and they moved up the street toward number 44 with the 2 Vey men falling in behind them from the corner position, and the light in the first-floor window of number 44 was on, and the shadow of someone moving was visible through the thin curtain. More than one shadow. Ronan reached the door first, tried the handle. Locked. He looked at the men behind him, and the one on the left, a decade of service in his expression, no unnecessary communication, already had the tools in his hand. 12 seconds. The door opened. Inside, a narrow entryway, coat hooks, a side table with a lamp, a staircase going up on the right. The light was coming from the room at the end of the hall. 2 voices audible. One, low, controlled, the voice of someone who is used to asking questions in confined spaces in the middle of the night. One higher, strained, with the specific quality of someone working very hard not to make sounds that would escalate a situation. Ronan moved down the hall with Selene 1 step behind, and the 2 men fanning out through the entryway behind them. He went through the door fast. The room was a study. Desk, bookshelves, a narrow window onto the back garden. Harlan Voss was in the desk chair. He was 60-something, slight, with the gray coloring of a man who hadn't slept well in years, and the red coloring of a man who was currently frightened and in pain. His right hand was on the desk, and a man Ronan didn't recognize was standing over it with a specific grip and a specific angle that communicated what had recently been applied to the fingers of that hand without requiring further description. The second man was near the bookcase. He turned when Ronan came through the door and made a decision that Ronan had already anticipated. And what followed was brief and controlled and ended with both men on the floor, one of them with a broken wrist, and the room considerably quieter than it had been 20 seconds earlier. Selene crossed directly to Voss. She crouched in front of him and said his name, Harlan, and his eyes found her and did something extreme for a moment, a rapid oscillation between recognition and disbelief, the specific destabilization of a man who has made peace with the death of something and is suddenly confronted with its continued existence. "Selene," his voice was a wreck. "I know." She took his uninjured hand in both of hers with a practicality that managed to contain something warmer beneath it. "I know. We need the drives, right now, before anyone else comes." He stared at her for another moment, then nodded, once, jerkily, and pointed at the bookshelf on the far wall. Third shelf from the top, behind a row of maritime law volumes, a document case in dark leather. Ronan crossed the room and retrieved it. They were out of the building in 4 minutes. They were back at the penthouse in 20. Voss came with them. There was no version of leaving him at Pelham Court that ended with him alive through the morning, and Selene communicated this to Ronan with a single look that he didn't need translated. The drives were intact. Ronan's technical operative, a man named Cito, who kept irregular hours and no social life and was the most capable person Ronan had ever employed for anything involving digital architecture, arrived at the penthouse at 1:30 a.m. and began working through the drives with the focused, bloodless efficiency of someone in their native environment. Ronan stood behind Sato and watched the files populate on the screen. Selene sat across the room with Voss, speaking to him in a low voice. Not comfort exactly, but orientation, the careful work of re-establishing a person in a reality they'd been violently disoriented from. Voss kept looking at his injured hand and then at her, as if both required the same quality of processing. "How long to verify the files?" Ronan said. "Authenticity checks, 2 hours. Full catalog, longer." Sato didn't look up. "You want me to prioritize anything?" "The V7 routing codes, and anything with direct voice identification of Magnus Vale." "On it." Ronan moved away from the screen and stood at the window. The harbor was dark and still at this hour, the rain finally and completely gone, and the lights on the water were clean and distinct in a way they weren't when weather disturbed them. He could see the Southport district from here. The gap in the skyline where his warehouses had been was not visible at this distance, but he knew where it was. He was thinking about Bartel. Bartel had been identified, pulled, and killed in the window between 6 p.m. and 11, which meant the order to kill him had been given very quickly after the identification. Too quickly for normal communication lag within an operation of Magnus's size, which meant Magnus had someone monitoring Ronan's internal communications at a level of access that was not limited to the 2 remaining names on the list. The access was deeper than 3 men. He kept that thought compartmentalized and turned toward the room. Selene had left Voss at the couch and crossed toward him. She moved differently in the penthouse now than she had 24 hours ago. Not comfortable, nothing so generous as that, but slightly less provisional, as though she had made some internal adjustment to the fact of being here. "He's going to be all right," she said, meaning Voss. "His hand needs a doctor." "I know. He won't go to a hospital. My people can handle it." He looked at her. "The drives. If what's on them is what you say it is, it is. Then we have a window." He kept his voice low. "A short one. Magnus knows Voss was a target tonight, and his men failed to retrieve what they were sent for. He'll adjust. He'll accelerate whatever his next move was." "The gala," she said. He looked at her. "He has an event in 6 days, the Vale Foundation's annual gala at the Meridian Tower." She crossed her arms, a rare gesture of self-containment. "He uses it every year as a visibility exercise. Politicians, press, donors, it's his most public face." Her eyes held Ronan's. "I've been planning to use it for 2 years." "To do what?" "To expose him." She said it without drama. "Publicly. In a room full of people who can't pretend they weren't present. The recordings, specific recordings, played in that room, in that context, would be impossible to contain or discredit afterward." Ronan was quiet. "You were planning this before the marriage," he said. "The gala was always the target. The marriage moved the timeline forward." She met his gaze steadily. "I needed to be inside your protection before I moved. I couldn't do it from outside. He would have killed me the moment I surfaced. And you were going to tell me this when? When I was sure you wouldn't stop me." He looked at her for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I'm telling you." He turned back to the window. 6 days. The gala was a public venue with Magnus's full security apparatus, press coverage, and the specific political protection that came with a room full of people who had been in Magnus's pocket long enough that his downfall would implicate their own. It was also, as she'd said, the one context in which the exposure couldn't be managed quietly, no cover-up possible when 300 witnesses were present. It was either a brilliant plan or a catastrophic one, and the difference between the two depended entirely on variables that wouldn't resolve until they were already inside the room. "I need to think about this," he said. "I know." She didn't push. One of her specific qualities, but she had made her case and she let it sit, didn't add pressure, didn't perform urgency. She simply delivered and waited. He started thinking. He was still thinking when Sato's voice came from across the room at 3:47 a.m. "Mr. Vey." Something in the tone brought Ronan across the room in 8 steps. Sato was looking at the screen with an expression he hadn't been wearing when Ronan had last looked at him. Something had shifted in the operative's face, a tightening around the eyes that preceded significant information on every occasion Ronan could recall. Authenticity checks are clear, Cito said. The files are real. The voice recordings match Magnus Vale's confirmed voice print against 3 reference samples. Then what's the problem? Cito turned in the chair and looked at Ronan with the specific discomfort of a man who was about to deliver information to a person he was not certain could receive it without consequences for the room. There's a second set of files on the drive. Cito's voice was careful. They weren't cataloged with the others. They're in a separate partition, different encryption. I almost missed them. What are they? Cito looked at the screen. Surveillance logs. From approximately 14 months ago. Communications records. He paused. They document a series of meetings between Magnus Vale and a contact identified in the files only by a code name. Ronan waited. The contact's physical description and the communications patterns match someone in your organization. Cito's voice had gone completely flat. Not a low-level contact, not logistics. The silence in the room changed quality. Cito turned the monitor so Ronan could read the screen directly. He read it. He read it again. The codename in the file was Meridian. The physical description was specific: height, build, identifying scar. The communications logs documented 11 meetings over 14 months at a location in the Harbor District. The last meeting was dated 9 days ago, 3 days before Magnus had first proposed the marriage arrangement through his intermediaries. The scar in the description was on the left side of the jaw, running toward the collar. Ronan went very still. He read the description a third time. He had a scar on the left side of his jaw, running toward his collar. That scar had been documented in 3 separate intelligence files that he was aware of. It was a known identifying feature. It was not unique to him. He turned. Crane was standing in the doorway of the study. He had been standing there for an unknown amount of time. He was looking at the monitor with the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he had not expected to happen tonight. And the specific quality of that expression, the fractional miscalculation in it, the quarter-second lag between what Crane's face had prepared to show and what it was actually showing, communicated something that 14 years of working alongside the man could not unsay. "Frank Castellano," Ronan said. His voice came out completely even. Crane's jaw tightened. "Crane," Ronan said, "tell me the description doesn't fit Castellano." A long silence. "I can explain," Crane started. "The description fits Castellano." Ronan's voice was still controlled, but underneath it something was happening that had no immediate outward expression, a kind of structural collapse, the specific interior sound of something that had been load-bearing for a long time, giving way all at once. "Castellano has the scar. Same location. He got it in 2009. I was there when it happened." "Ronan, Castellano called me tonight. He wasn't looking at Crane anymore. He was looking at the middle distance, which was the thing his eyes did when his mind was moving faster than the room. He adjusted. After I told him about the evidence, he adjusted very quickly, and then he offered his people in the Harbor District." Silence. "He was offering intelligence to Magnus about what we knew," Ronan said. "He adjusted because he needed to communicate the new information quickly, and offering the Harbor District contacts gave him a reason to make calls tonight." He turned to look at Crane fully. "Did you know?" he said. Crane's face was a controlled surface over something very complicated. "Not specifically. I had concerns, things that didn't reconcile. I was investigating." "You were investigating Castellano and you didn't tell me." "I didn't have enough to bring to you. You needed certainty." Ronan's voice dropped to a register that Crane had heard perhaps 3 times in 14 years, and which had always preceded events that Crane subsequently did not discuss. "So while you were building certainty, Bartell is dead and Magnus knows the exact contents of our last 2 days of conversation." Crane said nothing. "Including the gala plan." Ronan looked at the screen again. The last communication log entry, 9 days ago. Which means Magnus will know about the gala within hours of Castellano's calls tonight. From behind him, Selene's voice. "He doesn't know about the gala. I only told you an hour ago." Ronan looked at her. "Castellano's last communication predates the gala conversation," she said. She had crossed to the monitor and was reading the logs with the rapid attention of someone who understood the document structure. "His most recent contact with my father was 4 days ago. He doesn't have anything from tonight yet." "Yet," Ronan said. "Yet." Ronan turned back to Crane. The room was very quiet. Voss had gone pale on the couch. Sato had rolled his chair slightly to the left, which was the operative's unconscious physical response to not wanting to be in the blast radius of what was about to happen. "Where is Castellano right now?" Ronan said. Crane was quiet for 2 seconds. "His residence. Put 4 men on that residence. No communication in or out. Nobody touches him." He held Crane's gaze. "And understand something clearly. Whatever you were doing, whatever your reasons were, we are going to have a very detailed conversation about it. Not tonight. Tonight I need your head functional. But it's coming." Crane nodded once. His face had gone to the controlled blankness of a man putting everything into a box for later because the present required his full operational capacity, and the box could be opened when they were still alive to open it. "The gala," Selene said. "If Castellano contacts my father before then, he won't." Ronan turned. 4 men on his residence starting now. He makes no calls he's not supervised on. He pulled his phone. "We have 6 days, we use them." "Magnus will still move against us before the gala," she said. "He moved against Voss in under 24 hours. He'll move against us directly when he realizes the Pelham retrieval failed." "I know." Ronan stood at the center of his study with the documents on the screen and the evidence in the drives and the 3 people in the room watching him, and the city outside the window going about its ordinary dark business 200 feet below, and he understood with complete clarity that the situation had just passed through a threshold. Not the threshold of the marriage, not the threshold of the fires, or the body in the Southport district, or the names in Selene's documents. This threshold, Castellano. 60 years old. 40 years of service. The man who had been at his father's side before he was at Ronan's. The man who had sat across from Ronan at 100 tables in 100 rooms and communicated loyalty with the specific reliability of long habit, and for at least 14 months, possibly longer, had been feeding Magnus Vale the operational intelligence of everything Ronan built and did and decided. Ronan had spent 7 years preparing to destroy Magnus Vale for what he had done to Daniel. He had not known that the man closest to his father's memory had been helping Magnus do it. The specific pain of that was not something he could afford to process right now, and not processing it was costing him something physical, a tightness in the chest, a flatness in the hands. He breathed through it. He put it in the box. He looked at Selene. "The gala," he said. "Walk me through exactly what you were planning." She walked him through it. It was meticulous. It was years of work compressed into a 70-minute operational plan. It was also, in its current form, dependent on resources and conditions that the Castellano situation had just significantly compromised. "We need to rebuild the access point," she said. "The broadcast equipment inside the venue. I had a contact in the AV team. I don't know if that contact is still viable." "We find out. We have 72 hours to secure the broadcast chain before Magnus has it checked and swept in prep for the event." She was pacing now, barely aware of it, the movement of a mind working through architecture that had lived in her head for so long it had its own geography. "If we can't secure the broadcast chain, we need an alternative delivery mechanism." "I have alternative delivery mechanisms. They need to be completely outside your standard network." Her eyes met his. "After tonight, we have to assume every channel Castellano knew about is compromised." "I know." Ronan picked up his phone. "We start over. Clean infrastructure. People Castellano has never met." He looked at Crane. "Can you build a clean cell in 72 hours? Crane's jaw was set. "Yes." "Then start now." At 4:30 a.m., Harlan Voss was moved to a safe house in the North Quarter where a doctor from Ronan's network attended to his hand. Seto continued working through the drives. Crane made calls that Ronan monitored from across the room with the specific attention of a man who was trusting an imperfect instrument because he had no better one available and the work required doing. Selene sat at the kitchen counter and wrote, not the legal pad this time, a single sheet of paper, in handwriting that was smaller and more deliberate than her earlier notes. She was drafting something. He could see the concentration in her posture, the forward lean, the way her left hand pressed flat on the counter beside the page, as she wrote with her right as though physically anchoring herself. He crossed to the kitchen and stood across the counter from her and looked at what she was writing without intending to read it specifically. She covered it with her hand, automatic, reflexive, and then looked at the hand covering it and then looked at him, and then moved the hand away. It was a list of names, 23 of them. Below each name, a date, a location, a brief notation. He looked at her. "The women," she said. Her voice was completely level. "The ones I know about, from the V7 routes." She looked at the list. "I've been keeping it for 4 years. I add to it when I find a new name." He looked at the list for a long moment. He had moved through a world of violence for 20 years, and he was not a sentimental man, and there were things on his ledger that he had made his peace with by the logic of the life he'd chosen. But there was something about that list, the handwriting, the dates, the specificity of a woman keeping names for 4 years in her memory against the day she could do something about them, that moved through his defenses by a route that defenses weren't designed to cover. "After the gala," he said, "every name on that list. We find what we can find." She looked up at him. "I'm not promising you what we'll find," he said, "but we look." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face did something he hadn't seen it do yet. Not relief, not gratitude. Something more complicated and more fragile than either. The specific expression of a person who has been alone in something for a very long time and has just registered the presence of another person inside it. "Okay," she said. It was 5 a.m., and the city was the particular gray of very early morning, and the gala was 6 days away, and they had a dead man in the Southport district, and a traitor in a safe house, and an enemy who was already moving, and a broadcast chain to build from nothing, and 23 names on a handwritten list, when Ronan's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice he recognized, older, male, the cultivated warmth of a man who had spent decades performing reasonableness. "Ronan." Magnus Vale's voice came through the phone like cold water. "I think we should talk, directly, without intermediaries." Ronan looked at Selene across the counter. She had gone completely still. "I think," Magnus continued, with the specific tone of a man who believed he held better cards than he was showing, "that my daughter has told you a great many things in the past 24 hours. Some of them are probably true, and I think you found something tonight that has shaken your confidence in your own organization." A pause. "I want you to know I respect what you've built, Ronan. I always have, which is why I'm extending this courtesy." Ronan said nothing. "I have something you need," Magnus said. "Something that makes everything Selene has told you irrelevant. A piece of this picture she doesn't know exists." Another pause. "Meet me. Alone. Tomorrow night. The location I'll send you in an hour. If you come alone and you listen, we can resolve this without burning the city down." The line was quiet. "And if I don't come?" Ronan said. A long pause. "Then what happens next," Magnus said, "is the kind of thing that can't be undone. For either of us." He let that sit for a moment. "You've spent 7 years wanting to destroy me for your brother. I understand that. I've respected it. But there are things about Daniel's death, Ronan, that you don't know. Things Selene couldn't tell you because she doesn't know them either." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Selene's hand closed on the counter edge. Ronan kept his voice completely flat. "I'll let you know." He ended the call. The kitchen was silent. He set the phone face down on the counter. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Selene, who was looking at him with an expression that had gone very careful. The look of someone watching a person they have begun, however cautiously, to trust. Standing at the edge of something that could go in multiple directions. "He knows something about Daniel," she said. It wasn't a question. "He says he does. He's using it." Her voice was careful. "That's what he does. He finds the thing that matters most, and I know what he does." Ronan's voice was quieter than he intended. She was silent for a moment. "Are you going to go?" she said. He looked at her across the counter with the list of 23 names between them and the drives on the other side of the room, and the weight of 7 years of one specific purpose pressing down on the present moment from every angle, and he said, "I don't know yet." And the honesty of it, the 4 words from a man who never admitted uncertainty, delivered in the gray light of a morning that was 6 days from something that couldn't be undone, was the most frightening thing. He didn't go to the meeting, not because he was afraid of what Magnus would say, Because he spent the remaining hours before dawn thinking through every version of that meeting, and in every version, the ending was the same. Ronan walked into a room Magnus had chosen, in a location Magnus had selected, at a time Magnus had proposed, and whatever Magnus said about Daniel, true or fabricated or some deliberate combination of both, the conversation existed to do one thing: to move Ronan off the gala, to break the 72-hour window before the clean cell was built, and the broadcast chain was secured, and the plan Selene had carried alone for years was finally within operational reach. Magnus knew about the gala now, or he was about to, which meant every hour mattered more than the one before it. He sent back one message to the unknown number at 6 a.m. Not interested. Then he turned his phone face up on the counter and looked at Selene and said, "Tell me about the AV contact inside the Meridian Tower." She told him. The contact's name was Petra, 30s, freelance broadcast technician, had worked the Vale Foundation Gala 3 years running as part of the venue's contracted media crew. Selene had cultivated the contact 2 years ago through a chain of introductions careful enough that the connection to Selene was not immediately traceable. Petra knew what she was being asked to help with. She had said yes. She had not said yes for money. Her sister was on a V7 route in 2021, Selene said. Her voice was flat and factual the way it always was when the information was the worst kind. She was recovered 18 months later through a nonprofit in the Harbor District. Petra has been waiting for something to do with that information ever since. Does she know you're still active? She knows someone is. She doesn't know it's me specifically. Selene looked at him. I kept the chain compartmentalized. If any one link broke, the others stayed intact. Contact her today, through your existing chain. Ronan stood. Tell her the timeline moved up. We need confirmation on the broadcast infrastructure inside the ballroom within 48 hours. She'll need access to the building for a site assessment. She has access. She's on the contracted crew. He picked up his phone. That's why we chose her. He spent the next 4 hours rebuilding from the ground up. Crane assembled the clean cell with the grim efficiency of a man performing penance through competence. 7 people, none of whom had crossed paths with Castellano professionally, none of whom appeared in any Vale-adjacent communication that Sato could identify. Communications on hardware that had never been inside the Vey network. A staging location in the northeast quarter, far from the port, far from everything that smelled like the last 40 years of Ronan's operational history. Ronan briefed them personally. No intermediaries, no documentation. The entire plan delivered verbally in a single session and then immediately compartmentalized by role, each person knowing only their piece, the full architecture existing only in 2 heads. His and Selene's. By the second day, the AV confirmation came back through Petra's chain. The ballroom broadcast system was accessible. There was a secondary input panel in the AV booth on the mezzanine level that could be routed to override the room's main screen and speaker array. The security sweep scheduled for 48 hours before the event would check for weapons and unauthorized devices. It would not check the AV booth specifically, because the AV booth was occupied by contracted staff during the event, and Magnus's security team had never considered it a vector. That was the gap. That was where they were going in. On the 3rd day, Magnus moved. The first indication was a car that Sato identified running surveillance on the penthouse building, registered to a shell company with 4 layers of separation from Vale infrastructure. But the shell company pattern matched 2 others Sato had traced in the drive documentation, and that was enough. Ronan relocated to the staging location in the northeast quarter that afternoon, and Selene came with him without being asked, and Harlan Voss remained at the safe house with 2 men on the door. The second indication was a federal subpoena delivered to Ronan's primary legal representation, demanding financial records for 8 Vey-linked entities. The timing was not coincidental. Magnus had accelerated his coordination with the federal surveillance apparatus, not through legitimate channels, through specific prosecutors he'd been managing for years, names that appeared in Selene's documentation and which Ronan was now looking at on the screen in the staging location's main room with the specific expression of a man assembling a picture that keeps getting larger the more he looks at it. He's trying to freeze your assets before the gala, Selene said. He's trying to freeze my ability to move. Ronan was already on the phone with his legal team, delivering instructions in the flat, sequential language of someone who had dealt with federal interference before and knew exactly which levers existed for slowing it. The subpoena buys him 48 hours of disruption, even if it doesn't hold. He just needs us occupied. Are we occupied? No. He ended the call. We're ahead. On the fourth day, Crane came to him with the third name. Not from Castellano's network, separate. A man named Ferris, Ronan's political liaison, who had been facilitating Magnus's access to the federal prosecutors for 8 months. The documentation was clean and unambiguous. Bank records, communications, a meeting at a Harbor District hotel 3 weeks prior. Ronan sat with that for 10 minutes. Then he had Ferris brought to the staging location, and he sat across from him in a bare room with a single overhead light, and he asked him everything, directly, without theater, and Ferris answered because he was looking at Ronan Vey in a bare room with a single overhead light, and there were no options that resembled good. What Ferris told him took 40 minutes. When it was finished, Ronan sat very still for a moment. Then he stood, walked out of the room, closed the door behind him, and stood in the hallway with his back against the wall and his eyes closed for approximately 30 seconds, which was the only version of falling apart he would permit himself in the middle of this. Selene was in the main room when he came back. She looked at his face and waited. Magnus has been building a case against me for 3 years, he said. Not legitimate evidence. Constructed. Through Ferris, through the prosecutors, through manufactured financial documentation. He looked at the wall. If the gala fails, if we don't get the recordings into that room in front of those people, he files everything within 24 hours. The case is designed to be irrefutable. How much of it would hold? Enough. He looked at her. Enough to keep me in federal proceedings for years. Long enough for everything to collapse. He paused. He built a contingency. If I moved against him directly, the contingency destroys me legally. If I don't move against him, he continues operating and eventually decides I'm more inconvenient than useful. So the gala isn't just the best option. It's the only option. He held her gaze. We get those recordings into that room or we lose everything. She looked back at him with the specific steadiness of a woman who had spent 14 years in exactly this position, the position of someone with no option except forward, and said, "Then we go forward." On the 5th day, Magnus issued a public statement announcing that Selene Vale had been diagnosed with a significant psychological condition and that her family had grave concerns about her welfare and the influence of individuals who may have taken advantage of her fragile state. The statement was released through 3 separate media outlets simultaneously. It was accompanied by a medical document bearing the letterhead of a psychiatric facility in another state, a facility, Seto confirmed within 2 hours, that was owned through 3 layers of corporate structure by a Vale subsidiary. Ronan read the statement in the staging location and felt the cold fury in his chest burn at a temperature it hadn't reached since the night he'd confirmed Magnus's responsibility for Daniel's death. Selene read it too. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she set the phone face down on the table and said very quietly, "He used that facility before. That's where he sent me the first time, after my first attempt to contact someone outside." Ronan looked at her. "The document is fabricated," she said, "but the facility is real. He used it as a mechanism for 6 years. She paused. "He's telling anyone who hears what I say tomorrow night that I'm not credible, that whatever comes out of my mouth is the product of a damaged mind." She looked at Ronan. "He's been planning this since the moment the Pelham retrieval failed. It won't hold once the recordings play. It only needs to hold for the first 20 minutes. While people are deciding whether to believe me or remove me from the room." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it was working very hard. "He needs the doubt to be there early, before the evidence lands." Ronan crossed the room and stood in front of her. He looked at her directly and let the full weight of what he was about to say carry without softening. "I need you on that stage tomorrow night, regardless of what he's published. I need you present and coherent and credible in a room full of people who've just read that statement." He paused. "Can you do it?" She met his eyes. He's tried to break me for 14 years, she said. "He failed." She held his gaze. "A press statement isn't going to be what does it." He nodded once. They spent the 5th night in the staging location going through the plan one final time. Every position, every contingency, every second of the 70-minute window from entry to broadcast to the moment the recordings ended, and the room became what it was going to become. Petra's final confirmation came through at 11 p.m. The AV booth was staged, the override route was tested, the input was live. Everything was in place and ready and waiting for tomorrow night. At some point around 2 a.m., Ronan found himself standing at the staging location's narrow window, looking at a street he didn't know particularly well, in a part of the city he rarely operated in, and Selene came and stood beside him without announcement, and for a while they were both just there, looking at the same unremarkable strip of nighttime city, not talking. "My brother," Ronan said. She waited. He wanted to be an architect. He said it to the window. Not the kind that designs buildings for money. The kind that cares about what a building does to the people who live near it. The kind that thinks about light and space as though they're actually going to matter to someone. He paused. He was good at it. She was quiet for a moment. How old was he? 23. What happened? Magnus needed a message sent to our father about a territory dispute. He chose Daniel because Daniel was the softest target. No operational role, no protection detail, no reason to expect it. His voice stayed flat. He wasn't meant to send a message about territory. He was meant to send a message about what Magnus was willing to do to get what he wanted. Selene was looking at the side of his face. "The people who took Daniel," she said. "Do you know who specifically?" 3 of them. 2 are dead. 1 is currently in Caracas living under a name he bought with money Magnus paid him. He paused. "He'll keep." She turned back to the window. "After tomorrow," she said, "what does your life look like?" He was quiet for a moment. "Smaller, probably. I've been carrying this a long time. I'm not sure what I look like without it." "You find out," she said. "That's what happens. You find out." He turned and looked at her. In the low light, she looked the way she'd looked that first night when the dress had fallen and everything had changed. Not the surface of her, but the depth. The specific quality of a person who has lived inside tremendous damage and come through it without becoming the damage. He didn't know how that happened. He wasn't sure it should have been possible. But she was standing here in a staging location in the northeast quarter of a city that had been trying to consume her since she was 14 years old, and she was completely intact, and tomorrow she was going to walk into a room full of people who would have heard that she wasn't, and she was going to prove every single one of them wrong. He said, "After tomorrow. I'd like to know what you look like too." She looked at him for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something more complicated and more earned than that. Something that had been a very long time in arriving. "Ask me on the other side," she said. The gala began at 8. They went in at 6:30 through the service entrance on the east side of the Meridian Tower, in the company of 4 members of the clean cell carrying equipment cases that matched the profile of contracted media crew. Petra met them in the service corridor on the 2nd level and moved them upward through the building's maintenance routes with the efficiency of someone who had memorized a path she'd been walking mentally for 2 years. The mezzanine. A V booth was accessible from a corridor that branched off the main service route 1 level above the ballroom floor. Small room, 2 meters by 3, banks of equipment along one wall, a narrow window looking down at the ballroom floor through smoked glass. The ballroom itself was empty at this hour, being prepared by catering staff moving in the organized patterns of people on a deadline. The chandeliers were up. The tables were clothed in white. The stage at the far end of the room was arranged with a lectern and Magnus Vale's particular taste for theatrical civic grandeur. Petra's hands moved over the equipment with practiced speed, routing the secondary input, testing the signal path, confirming that what they were about to play into that system would override every other visual and audio source in the room simultaneously and without warning. "How long can you hold the override before building security traces it?" Ronan asked. 15 minutes if they're looking for it, 20 if they're not. Petra didn't look up. "After that, they can kill the power to the booth, but they can't kill what's already been broadcast." 15 minutes is enough. "The recordings are 11 minutes total." She looked up at him. "At the 11-minute mark, every phone in this room is going to have received a simultaneous push from the secondary broadcast, video and audio compressed for mobile. Even if they kill the ballroom system at minute 12, the recordings are on 300 personal devices." Selene behind him. "My father will try to remove me from the room before 11 minutes. "He's going to try to remove you the moment you step onto that stage," Ronan said. "I know. That's what I'm there for." She looked at him. A look that was clean and direct and held a quality of trust that he understood had not been given easily or quickly and was not being given carelessly now. "Don't get shot," she said. "Working on it." The guests began arriving at 8. Ronan watched from the mezzanine window as the ballroom filled. The city's assembled wealth and power flowing in through the main doors in evening dress. The specific density of people who had cultivated the ability to look comfortable in rooms that were fundamentally about performance. Politicians whose names appeared in Selene's documents. Media figures who had been carefully managed for a decade. Business contacts whose relationships with Magnus Vale appeared in federal filings as legitimate and in Sato's analysis as the opposite. Magnus arrived at 8:20. He came in through the main entrance with a detail of 6 men and the particular ease of a man attending his own ritual. Comfortable, assured, entirely in possession of the environment he'd constructed. He moved through the room greeting people with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades understanding that warmth was a more effective tool than fear in civilian spaces. Ronan watched him from above through the smoked glass. He watched Magnus stop near the bar and speak to a man he recognized as one of the federal prosecutors Ferris had named. He watched Magnus place a hand on the prosecutor's shoulder in the casual way of someone confirming an arrangement that was already in place. He watched Magnus glance toward the stage with the satisfaction of a man who believes the evening belongs to him. Then Magnus's gaze moved upward, along the walls of the ballroom, to the mezzanine level. He stopped at the smoked glass of the AV booth for 2 seconds. He couldn't see through it. The glass was one way. But the stop was deliberate, and the 2 seconds had the quality of a man taking a specific measurement. He knew. Not specifically. Not the booth. Not the broadcast route. Not the 11 minutes. But he knew something was in play. He had known since Pelham Court. He had been preparing since Pelham Court and the press statement and the federal subpoena, and the ease with which he was moving through this room was not the ease of a man who was unaware of the threat. It was the ease of a man who believed his preparation was sufficient. Ronan turned from the window. "He has something we don't know about," he said. Crane, positioned near the booth door. "What makes you think—" He looked at this booth. Ronan's voice was low. He looked at it specifically. He wasn't searching. He went directly to it. Crane was quiet for 2 seconds. Someone told him. Someone told him. Ronan looked at Selene. Not the full plan, but enough. The booth. Selene's face went through a rapid calculation. Petra's chain could be clean. Ronan was already moving toward the booth door. Or the leak is somewhere else. Either way, it doesn't change what we do. It changes his preparation. He stopped. He's going to have someone on the booth. Probably 2 people positioned to cut the power or remove us physically when the broadcast starts. So we start earlier than planned, Selene said. We start when you're on that stage, Ronan said. The moment you're at the lectern, we go. Don't wait for the introduction to finish. Don't wait for the room to settle. The moment the microphone is live. She nodded. And the security, she said. My people are in position on the floor. The moment Magnus's men move toward the stage, they intercept. He met her eyes. You get the full 11 minutes. And if your people can't hold them, then I hold them. He said it without drama. Personally, if necessary. She looked at him for a long moment. I've been planning this for 2 years, she said. I've run every version. I know the risk. I know you do. I'm not asking you to protect me from the risk. I'm not offering to. He held her gaze. I'm offering to stand between you and the risk while you finish what you started. The room below was full now. 300 people in evening dress. The clink of glasses and the low roar of assembled conversation rising through the smoked glass like something the building was exhaling. The chandeliers threw light across the white tables in the specific way of expensive events designed to make people feel that what was happening was important and sanctioned and real. At 8:50, the Foundation's event coordinator moved to the stage and began the introduction. Selene picked up the drive, a single small device, matte black, the physical container of 11 minutes that had taken 14 years to assemble, and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Ronan. This is the part, she said, where we find out if it was worth it. He looked back at her. It was already worth it. She moved toward the door. He was one step behind her. They came through the mezzanine access and down the staircase to the ballroom level and through the service door onto the floor while the event coordinator was still in the middle of the introduction and Ronan felt the specific shift in his body that happened at the beginning of things that couldn't be undone. The drop in peripheral awareness, the sharpening of the center, the way time seemed to organize itself differently when the decision was made and the action was in progress and there was nothing left to calculate because the calculation was finished. He scanned the room. Two of Magnus's men near the stage, positioned casually but with the weight distribution of people ready to move. One near the main doors watching entry points. Magnus himself at a table near the center of the room, and as Ronan watched, Magnus looked up from the person he was speaking to and found Ronan's position with the immediate accuracy of a man who had been watching the door. Their eyes met across the width of the ballroom. Magnus held the look for 3 seconds. Then he turned and said something low to the man beside him. The man began moving toward the stage. "Now," Ronan said. Selene was already moving. She crossed the floor at a pace that was controlled and visible. Not running, not skulking, the decisive stride of someone who belonged at the front of the room and was arriving at the front of the room. The event coordinator was still speaking when Selene reached the steps at the side of the stage, and the coordinator stopped mid-sentence with the specific paralysis of someone whose event plan has just been physically superseded. Selene stepped onto the stage. She crossed to the lectern. She put the drive into the input panel that Petra had confirmed was live and routed to the overhead system. And then she looked out at the room. 300 faces looked back at her. The room had gone from the rolling murmur of 300 conversations to a silence that was not quite complete. Still the clink of a glass, someone's chair, the HVAC of a building that didn't know history was happening inside it, but was close enough to complete that her voice, when she spoke into the live microphone, reached every person present without effort. "My name is Selene Vale," she said, "and I have something that belongs to this room." Magnus's man was 8 feet from the stage steps. Ronan was between him and the steps. The man looked at Ronan with the assessment of someone doing a quick professional calculation, and whatever conclusion he reached, he stopped moving. "Good," Ronan said quietly. "Stay there." On the stage, Selene's voice was steady and clean and utterly without performance. The voice of someone who had been waiting so long for this moment that the moment itself felt less like arrival than continuation. "What you're about to hear," she said, "was recorded over a period of 6 years inside my father's organization. It documents the planning and execution of human trafficking operations responsible for the disappearance of at least 23 women from this city and the surrounding region." She paused. "It documents my father's direct involvement, in his own voice, in his own words." The room made a sound. Magnus stood up from his table. On the screens above the stage and on the speakers arrayed around the ballroom's perimeter, the recordings began to play. Magnus's voice filled the room. The same voice that had called Ronan's phone 3 days ago. The same cultivated warmth that the room had been listening to for 30 years through charitable foundations and civic donations, and the practiced smile of a man who had understood very early that visibility was the best cover a criminal could have. That voice, coming out of the speakers above 300 people's heads, saying things that voice was not supposed to ever say out loud in a room like this. The silence that followed the first 30 seconds was the most complete Ronan had ever heard in an occupied space. Magnus moved. Came across the room at a pace that was not quite running, the contained fast walk of a man who had spent decades not running because running communicated panic, and Magnus Vale did not communicate panic. He was looking at the stage, not at Ronan, and he had 3 men behind him and 1 more coming in from the main door, and Ronan stepped directly into his path and stopped. Magnus stopped 2 feet from him. They looked at each other. The recordings played above them. "Move," Magnus said. His voice was very quiet and very cold, and had dropped entirely the warmth it wore for other occasions. This was the voice underneath the cultivated voice. Older, harder, the voice of the thing that had been making the decisions all along, while the other voice performed reasonableness for the audience. "No," Ronan said. Magnus looked at him with the specific assessment of a man who has had people killed and is currently doing the arithmetic. "You don't understand what you're doing," Magnus said. "I understand exactly what I'm doing." Ronan kept his voice at the same low register. Around them, the room was erupting. Guests on their feet, phones out. The specific chaos of 300 people simultaneously receiving information that reorganized their understanding of the last 30 years of Blackwater City. I'm standing here while she finishes. She's gonna burn everything. Yes. Ronan looked at the man in front of him. The man who had ordered Daniel taken, who had built a machine of violence behind 30 years of charitable performance, who had used his own daughter as a tool and a casualty and a hostage, and believed he had broken her, and felt the 7-year-long architecture of revenge resolve itself, in this moment, into something simpler and more absolute than anything he'd planned for. That's the point. Magnus's right hand moved. Ronan had been watching the right hand since Magnus crossed the room, because that was the hand Magnus favored, and that was the tell he'd identified in the 30 seconds since they'd been standing this close. And when the hand moved, Ronan moved first, stepped inside the distance, one hand catching the wrist, redirecting, using Magnus's own forward momentum to drive the man sideways into the nearest table with a crash of glassware and white linen that sent guests scrambling backward in a wave. Magnus hit the table and came off it fast, faster than a 63-year-old man had any right to be, and Ronan registered that with the professional attention of someone recalibrating mid-engagement. The first man behind Magnus reached Ronan a second later, and Ronan took a hit across the left side of his face that was solid enough to send white into the edges of his vision, and he used the momentum of it to turn into the man's body and put him down with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had no time budget for anything decorative. The second man had a hand on Ronan's collar when the clean cell members on the floor reached them. What followed was approximately 90 seconds of controlled violence in the center of a ballroom, surrounded by 300 witnesses with active phone cameras, which was either the worst context for violence or the best depending entirely on whose side you were on. On the stage, the recordings played. Selene stood at the lectern with both hands flat on its surface and her eyes on the room, watching the chaos, watching her father's containment disintegrate, watching the faces of 300 people as 11 minutes of her father's voice dismantled 30 years of his construction, and she did not move from the lectern, and she did not stop the recordings, and she did not look away. 6 minutes in, Magnus was on the floor with 2 of Ronan's people on him, and the 3 remaining Vale security men had made the professional calculation that the room was lost and were backing toward the exits. And Ronan was standing with blood running from a cut above his left eyebrow, and his jacket torn at the shoulder and his breath coming hard. And the recordings were still playing, and the room was still listening. Magnus looked up from the floor. He looked at his daughter on the stage. He looked at Ronan standing between them. Something happened in his face in that moment. Not defeat exactly, not the collapse of a man who has finally acknowledged the end of something. Something worse than that. The specific expression of a man who has understood that the thing he built to protect himself has become the architecture of his exposure, and that the person responsible for that inversion is a woman he raised and broke and underestimated and underestimated and underestimated until the underestimation became the fatal error of his entire life. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. At the 11-minute mark, the recordings ended. The room was silent. Selene straightened at the lectern. She looked out at 300 people, some standing, some seated, some with phones still raised, some who hadn't moved since the recordings began, politicians whose names she had just spoken into the record, media figures whose coverage of her father's legacy would now become the coverage of his destruction. The prosecutor from near the bar who was currently looking at his phone with the expression of a man watching his own career ending in real time. Her father, on the floor, looking up at her. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I told you I remembered everything." And then the doors opened. Not Magnus's men. They were gone, or down, or standing at the walls with the specific stillness of people who have chosen to be furniture. The doors opened, and the people who came through them were carrying credentials and the specific purposeful energy of people who had been outside a room for 11 minutes waiting for a cue that had just been delivered to every phone in the building simultaneously. Federal agents. The arrangement had been Ronan's, made 2 days prior through channels that bypassed every compromised prosecutor and every corrupted federal liaison, going directly to a federal organized crime division that had been building a case on Magnus Vale for 6 years and had lacked the one thing that made the difference between investigation and prosecution. Recorded evidence, in Magnus Vale's own voice, played to 300 witnesses, and now simultaneously delivered to every phone in the room already spreading outward through every network those 300 phones connected to, already beyond the capacity of any legal mechanism or financial pressure or fabricated psychiatric document to contain or discredit or silence. Ronan stood in the middle of the ballroom with blood on his face and the wreckage of a dozen upended tables around him and watched the federal agents cross the room toward Magnus Vale. Magnus was on his feet by then. He was standing with the stillness of a man who has arrived at the moment he has been avoiding for 30 years and has discovered that arrival, whatever else it is a form of relief from the effort of avoidance. He looked at the agents coming toward him with an expression that was unreadable and very old. One of the agents said his name. Magnus Vale looked across the room one final time, not at Ronan, at Selene. She looked back at him from the stage with the specific steadiness of a woman who had been looking at this moment for 14 years and had made herself into whatever she needed to be to reach it. And whatever passed between them in that look was theirs alone and would never require translation for anyone else. Then the agents had him, and he was moving toward the door, and the room erupted into the specific noise of 300 people simultaneously releasing the breath they'd been holding for 11 minutes. And Ronan crossed to the stage steps and looked up at Selene standing at the lectern with her hand still flat on its surface and her face doing something he had never seen it do before in the 6 days he had known her. She was shaking, not dramatically, not the visible shaking of shock or breakdown. The fine, nearly invisible tremor of a body that has been held at extreme tension for an extremely long time and has just received the signal that the tension is no longer required and doesn't quite know what to do with the information. He went up the steps. He stopped beside her. He didn't touch her. She hadn't asked to be touched, and this was not the moment to make assumptions about what she needed. He just stood beside her in the way that said, "I'm here," and "It worked," and "You did it," without requiring any of those things to be spoken. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was steady. The tremor was already quieting. "Your face," she said. He'd forgotten about the cut. He reached up and touched it, and his fingers came away red, and he looked at them with the mild interest of someone noting a detail that will require attention later. "It's fine," he said. "It's not fine." She reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, a gesture of familiarity that neither of them acknowledged as the specific and significant thing it was, and produced the folded cloth she'd apparently put there at some point before they left the staging location, and pressed it against the cut above his eye with a practicality that was, in its own way, something he was going to think about later. He held it there. Below them, the ballroom was organized chaos, agents, guests, the ongoing noise of a room that had just been irreversibly reorganized. At the far door, Magnus Vale disappeared into the custody of people whose job it was to make sure he didn't disappear anywhere else. "He's gone," Selene said. "He's gone," Ronan confirmed. She stood beside him on the stage above the ruined ballroom and looked at the space her father had just vacated and breathed. Just breathed, audibly, the specific long exhalation of someone setting down something that has been in their hands for so long, the weight of it had become indistinguishable from the weight of themselves. Below them, through the glass walls of the tower, Blackwater City pressed outward in every direction. The harbor, the port, the streets and buildings, and the long wet reach of the night. And it was still the same city it had been this morning, and it was also completely different, and both of those things were true simultaneously in the way that moments of actual consequence produced, and neither of them had the words for it yet, and the cloth against his eye was already soaked through. Selene noticed before he did, she was always noticing things before they were announced, before they became a problem that demanded response. A habit built from years of living in an environment where anything unnoticed could become catastrophic. She pressed harder and he reached up and covered her hand with his without thinking about it, and they stood like that for a moment on the stage above the dismantled ballroom, while the federal agents below moved through the room with the systematic efficiency of people executing a procedure they had been preparing for, and whose preparation had just been rendered possible by 11 minutes of audio playing through a ballroom speaker system. "You need stitches," she said. "Later. Now." She said it with the specific flatness that had no argument in it. "You're going to be talking to federal agents within the next 20 minutes, and you're going to do it without bleeding through your eye." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "Fine," he said. They came down from the stage together, and a woman from the clean cell, the one with medical training, whose name was Adara, who had been positioned on the floor for exactly this category of contingency, met them at the bottom of the steps and produced a kit from inside her jacket with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone whose entire value in these situations was her refusal to be surprised by anything. She pressed Ronan into a chair at the nearest table and began working on the cut with the focused, impersonal attention of a mechanic addressing a mechanical problem. Selene stood 3 feet away and watched the room. Below the stage, Magnus's remaining security personnel had been collected, some compliant, some not, all now in the company of federal agents who had very specific training for the not-compliant variety. The guests had not been permitted to leave and were clustered in groups throughout the ballroom, some still with phones raised, some in what appeared to be intense personal conversations, some simply standing with the dazed quality of people who have just watched the load-bearing wall of their understanding of 30 years of civic life removed in 11 minutes. The prosecutor was being spoken to by 2 agents near the far wall, and his body language was the specific language of a man deciding, in real time, how much cooperation he could offer before it became confession. The lead federal agent crossed the room toward Ronan. His name was Braddock, mid-50s, compact, the kind of face that had been unreadable since approximately 1987. He had been the contact Ronan had reached through the clean channel 2 days prior, the man who had been building the case for 6 years and lacked the evidence, and who had listened to Ronan's account of what existed and what was about to happen with the specific contained attention of someone who has been waiting for a call like this long enough that receiving it required a moment of internal recalibration before response. He stopped in front of Ronan and looked at the cut being worked on and didn't comment on it. "Mr. Vey," he said. "Braddock. Your wife." He looked at Selene. "She'll need to come in. Tonight, ideally. Full statement." "She knows." Ronan looked at Selene. "She's been waiting to give it for 2 years." Selene met Braddock's eyes. "I have documentation in addition to the recordings. Physical documents and a complete archive of digital files." She paused. "I also have a witness, a former maritime attorney named Harlan Voss who advised on the evidentiary process. His location can be provided." Braddock looked at her for a moment with the careful attention of a man assessing not just what she was saying, but the quality of the person saying it, the degree to which she would hold together under the extended process that was coming, the months of federal procedure and deposition and cross-examination, and the specific sustained pressure that Magnus's legal team would apply the moment they recovered from tonight's shock. Whatever he found in her face appeared to satisfy something in his professional calculus. "I'll need you at the federal building by 11 p.m., he said. "I'll be there." Braddock looked at Ronan. The look had a different quality. The look of a man who had cooperated with a person he would, under other circumstances, be investigating, and who was now navigating the specific complexity of what that cooperation meant going forward. "We're going to have a conversation," Braddock said, "about your organization, about what you're prepared to offer in terms of structural adjustments." "I know," Ronan said. "I've been thinking about what I'm prepared to offer." "And?" "Significant." He held the man's gaze. "I'll come in tomorrow morning, with my legal representation. We'll talk." Braddock looked at him for another moment, then nodded once and moved away, back into the organized machinery of a federal operation that had just received the most significant single evening of evidence in its 6-year history. Adara pressed a final strip of closure tape above Ronan's eye and stepped back. 4 stitches would be better, she said. "The tape will hold if you don't get hit again tonight." "I'll make a note," Ronan said. She moved away. He stood up. The room was thinning now. Guests being processed and released, agents moving in the patterns of a scene being secured and documented. The wreckage of the tables where the engagement had happened was already being photographed by people with evidence bags and the specific unhurried attention of people for whom disorder was data. Someone had righted the lectern on the stage. The screens above it were dark and blank. The ballroom chandeliers threw their uninterrupted light over everything equally. The federal agents and the guests, and the overturned chairs and the white tablecloths stained with spilled wine, and the one table that had been structurally compromised when Ronan had driven Magnus into it, with the specific indifference of expensive fixtures to the events beneath them. Ronan looked at the table where Magnus had been sitting when the recordings began. Empty chair. The place setting still arranged. A glass of something amber-colored, barely touched. He looked at it for a moment, 7 years. He waited for something to arrive, some resolution, some feeling of completion, the specific interior shift that the long execution of a long plan was supposed to produce when it finally finished. He waited with the honest attention of a man who had learned not to lie to himself about what was actually present in his own chest. What arrived was quieter than he expected. Not emptiness, not the flat aftermath of something that had consumed everything and left nothing behind. Something more like the specific silence of a room after a piece of furniture that had been there so long you stopped seeing it has been removed. The absence of a weight you had stopped registering as weight. Daniel would have been 30 years old now. He would have designed buildings that cared about light. Ronan let himself have that thought fully and completely for the first time in 7 years. Let it arrive without immediately converting it into something operational. Let it simply be the true thing that it was, and it hurt in the specific clean way of a wound being finally seen in proper light. Not the festering hurt of something kept in the dark, but the honest hurt of something real. He breathed through it. He was still breathing through it when Selene appeared beside him and looked at the same empty chair. "Is it what you thought it would be?" she said. He looked at the chair for a moment longer. "No." He looked at her. "It's smaller." She nodded. "It always is." She paused. "That's not a bad thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They left the Meridian Tower at 10:15. The night outside was clear. The rain that had been the weather of this entire story finally fully gone. The sky overhead, the deep cold black of a clear night in a city that produced enough light to wash out the stars, except for the brightest. The street in front of the tower had the particular quality of a location where something significant had recently happened and the world hadn't caught up yet. Police vehicles, federal presence, a small cluster of media who had been tipped and arrived too late for the event itself, and were now positioned hopefully outside a building from which the story had already escaped through 300 personal phones and was currently moving through every network those phones touched at the speed that information moved in Blackwater City, which was the speed of fire through dry material. A car was waiting, clean cell vehicle, driver from the new network. They got in. Ronan gave Braddock's federal building as the destination. Selene had her hands in her lap, and she was looking out the window at the city moving past, and her face in the window's reflection had the quality of a person processing something that was too large to process in any single sitting and had made peace with the fact that it would require time. "Castellano," she said. "Tomorrow." Ronan kept his eyes forward. "Tonight's work is tonight's work." She was quiet. "What happens to him?" "He talks to Braddock." Ronan's voice was even. "Everything he knows about the Vale interface goes on the record. In exchange for cooperation, the federal case against him is structured to account for it." He paused. "He doesn't come back to my organization. That's it. He's 60 years old. He's going to spend whatever he has left carrying what he did." Ronan looked at his hands for a moment. "That's enough." She absorbed this. "You're not going to, No." He said it without decoration. "That's not what tonight was." She looked at him. "Tonight was about exposure," he said, "not execution. That matters." She was quiet for a long moment. "It's different from what I expected from you." 6 days ago. "Yes." A pause. 6 days ago. They drove in silence for a while. The city moved past the windows, the financial district, the harbor, the older neighborhoods transitioning to the institutional density of the Civic Center, where the federal building stood lit against the dark, with the specific cold authority of institutions that operated regardless of what happened around them. "I need to ask you something," Ronan said. She looked at him. "The anonymous message, the one that sent us to Voss." He held her gaze. "Do you know who sent it?" She was quiet for 2 seconds. 1 second too long for someone who genuinely didn't know. "Selene." She looked out the window. "His name is Lev. He's been inside my father's operation for 4 years. He was one of the men assigned to the estate, one of the security staff." She paused. "He was the one who left the door unlocked. Twice. On the 2 occasions I managed to remove documents. He was helping you. He was doing what he could." Her voice was careful. "He couldn't do much, but he did what he could. And the message, He monitors my father's communications. He knew the Pelham retrieval was ordered before it happened. She turned back to look at Ronan. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how you'd respond to learning there was someone in Magnus's operation that I'd been in contact with. You thought I'd see it as a security risk. I thought you might. She met his eyes. I should have told you. Yes, he said, without anger. You should have. I know. She held his gaze. I'm sorry. He looked at her for a moment. Where is he now? I don't know. After the message, nothing. He goes dark when he moves. He knows how to disappear. She paused. He has a daughter. I know that much. 8 years old. He joined the estate security to support her after her mother died. Ronan was quiet. Find him, he said. After everything settles, find him. Something in her face shifted. A fractional softening, quickly controlled but present. Okay, she said. The federal building was exactly what federal buildings always were. Utilitarian, well-lit, staffed at this hour by people who had received a call about what had just happened at the Meridian Tower, and were currently functioning at the elevated efficiency of an institution whose evening had just become unexpectedly consequential. Braddock met them in the lobby. He took Selene through a door, and Ronan sat in the lobby on a chair that had been selected for its disincentive to comfort, and was doing its job effectively. And he sat with the cut above his eye and the torn shoulder of his jacket, and the specific exhaustion of a man who had been running at maximum capacity for 6 days, and whose body was now presenting a bill that the evening had temporarily deferred. He sat for 3 hours. At one point, Crane came in and sat in the adjacent chair without preamble, and they looked at the lobby's institutional floor for a while without speaking. Marchetti, Ronan said. Cooperating. Crane's voice was its usual flat instrument. Gave them 6 names. 2 of them are Vale's people we hadn't identified yet. Reyes. Turned up in the Harbor District, voluntarily. He's talking to Braddock's people now. Crane paused. He's scared. He should be. Silence. The clean cell, Crane said. What do you want to do with them after tonight? Keep them. Ronan looked at the floor. Rebuild around them. The old structure is finished. A lot of it. Most of it. He was quiet for a moment. The parts worth keeping, we keep. The parts that aren't, we don't. He looked at Crane. That includes the evaluation we need to have about your months of private investigation into Castellano. Crane's jaw moved. I understand. Tomorrow, Ronan said. Tonight's work is tonight's work. Crane nodded, and they sat in silence again, and the lobby's fluorescent light was unkind to everything it touched, and neither of them cared particularly. At 1:30 a.m., Harlan Voss was brought in, transported from the safe house. His hand properly splinted and wrapped now, his color improved, wearing the specific expression of a man who has spent years believing he was the last keeper of something that mattered, and has just discovered that the something has been delivered to the people who could act on it. He walked through the lobby past Ronan with a brief pause. She planned this for a long time, Voss said. Not accusatory, just declarative. I know, Ronan said. She's extraordinary. Voss looked at the door he was about to be taken through. Whatever you think you understand about her, you probably understand about half. I'm working on the other half, Ronan said. Voss looked at him for a moment with the assessing attention of a careful man evaluating an uncertain situation. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone who hasn't yet decided something but has decided to provisionally withhold the negative, and went through the door. Selene came out at 2:40 a.m. She looked exactly as composed as she'd looked going in, which Ronan knew by now meant she was running on the specific resource of people who have been trained by circumstance to run long after the fuel gauge reads empty. She sat down in the chair beside him and for a moment didn't speak. How was it? He said. Long? She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. They're good at their jobs. Braddock especially. She paused. They already have enough to hold him through the initial proceedings. The recordings, plus the documentation, plus Voss's testimony, plus whatever the room full of witnesses produces over the next 72 hours. It holds. It holds. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. The trafficking investigation goes separate track, different team. They want me in again in 3 days for the operational detail, the roading codes, the V7 documentation. You'll be ready? I'm already ready. She said it without bravado. Simple fact. I've been ready for 2 years. I've been running the details in my head every night for 2 years. I could give them the full picture in my sleep. He looked at her profile. The lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the set of her jaw that hadn't changed in 6 days, the specific quality of a person whose composure was not a performance and not a defense mechanism, but simply the shape their character had taken under sustained pressure, the way iron takes the shape of what it's been hammered against. Come on, he said. We're done for tonight. She stood. Outside the federal building, the night was at its quietest hour. The particular stillness of a city at 3 a.m., when even the restless elements had temporarily subsided and the streets had the quality of a stage between performances. The car was waiting. The driver was from the clean cell and had been waiting for 3 hours without complaint and without visible impatience, which Ronan noted and filed as a quality worth remembering. They drove back through the city, not to the staging location and not to the penthouse. Both were active scenes now. The penthouse still under the surveillance adjustment Ronan had ordered days ago, the staging location being wound down by the clean cell as its operational purpose concluded. The driver took them to a building in the west quarter that Ronan owned through a structure clean enough to be invisible, the top floor apartment maintained as a secondary location for exactly these categories of night. It was smaller than the penthouse, quieter. No harbor view. The window looked onto a residential street lined with the old plane trees that this neighborhood had kept when the rest of the city had replaced everything organic with glass and concrete. The furnishings were minimal and functional and had no aesthetic ambition whatsoever, which made the space, paradoxically, feel more habitable than the expensive showcase of the Meridian Tower apartment. Selene stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it. "This is yours," she said. "One of several." He moved to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, brought it back. She took it without commentary and drank half of it. "It's quiet." "It is." She looked at the window. The street below was empty and the plane trees moved slightly in the night air, and the light on them was the amber of old street lamps rather than the white cold of commercial lighting. "I haven't slept properly I don't remember." "The room on the right," he said. "It's separate. It has a lock." She looked at him. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not making assumptions about anything." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, something he was getting better at reading, the specific vocabulary of a face that communicated in small denominations rather than large gestures, where a fractional shift of the eyes said what other people said with their whole faces. "I know you're not," she said. She went to the room on the right. She didn't close the door fully, left it ajar by 2 or 3 inches in the way of someone who had spent years in enclosed spaces and had a complex relationship with shut doors. And the light in the room went on briefly and then off, and the apartment was quiet. Ronan sat at the kitchen table. He sat there for a long time with a glass of water he didn't drink, and the exhaustion of 6 days settling into his body with the comprehensive weight of something that had been postponed and was no longer willing to be postponed. His shoulder ached where it had been hit. The cut above his eye throbbed with the specific, insistent rhythm of tissue that had been told to close and was still in the process of negotiating with the instruction. His hands, resting on the table, looked to him like the hands of someone who had been doing the things he'd been doing for 20 years, which was what they were, and which was something he was beginning to look at differently than he had 6 days ago. He thought about the conversation he would have with Braddock in the morning. "Significant," he'd said. He'd been thinking about what significant meant for 2 days, running the architecture of it the way he ran every operational problem, from multiple angles, looking for the version that was viable. What he'd arrived at was not simple and would not be comfortable and would take time and would cost him things he'd built over 20 years that were not all worth keeping but were familiar in the way that anything built over 20 years became familiar. He would give Braddock the financial infrastructure behind 3 major distribution networks, the detailed mechanics, the people, the accounts. He would give him 12 names in addition to the ones already surfaced. He would cooperate on the Vale-adjacent investigations fully and without reservation, which meant the federal case would be the most comprehensive prosecution of organized criminal civic corruption in Blackwater City's history, which meant the city was going to go through something difficult for the next several years as the structure beneath its surface was excavated and exposed. In exchange, the organization he retained would be a fraction of its previous size. The money would be clean or it wouldn't be moved. The operations that depended on the kind of institutional protection that was about to evaporate would be wound down. Some of the men who'd served him for a decade would go other directions. The machine he'd inherited from his father and expanded and used, not always for things Daniel would have been proud of, would be substantially dismantled. He sat with that. He was sitting with it when he heard the movement from the room on the right. Not distress, just wakefulness. The sound of someone turning over and finding that sleep had retreated to a distance not immediately crossable. He knew the sound because he'd been making it himself for most of the last 6 days, and for significant portions of the 7 years before that. He got up and went to the doorway. She was sitting up in the bed in the dark, her back against the headboard, her knees drawn up. She turned her head when he appeared in the doorway. She always heard him before he announced himself. Another reflex built over years in environments where late arrivals required immediate categorization. "Sorry," he said. "You weren't making noise." She looked at the window. The plane tree's shadows moved across the wall. "I just can't." "I know." He leaned against the doorframe. They sat in the specific companionable silence of two people who had spent 6 days at the edge of something and had come through it and were now in the strange open country on the other side, where the urgency that had structured everything was gone, and what remained was what actually existed between them once the urgency was removed. What remained was considerable. "The 23 names," he said. "I've been thinking about a structure, a foundation, not a veil-style front, something actual. Money from the financial settlements that are going to come out of the federal proceedings, directed towards survivor services and the investigation of the cold cases." She looked at him. "Voss could run the legal component," he said. "He's out of practice, but he still knows how the architecture works, and he has something to prove now that he has a license to prove it with. The Bar Association will reinstate him," she said, "once the fabricated complaint is part of the public record." "Yes." Ronan looked at the moving shadows on the wall. "I know someone who can accelerate that process." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been planning this?" "For about 48 hours. He looked at her. "I wanted to tell you before I moved on anything." She held his gaze in the dark. "The women on the list," she said. "Some of them are gone. Some of them, we won't find them." "I know." "You need to go in with that understanding. You can't build something like this expecting a good outcome. Some of the outcomes are going to be the worst possible outcome, and you have to be able to sustain the structure anyway." "I know that," he said. "I've been in this city for 40 years. I know what the worst possible outcome looks like." She was quiet. "But some of them are findable," he said. "Petra's sister was found. 18 months later, but she was found. That happened because someone was looking. We can make it happen more often." He paused. "We won't make it happen every time, but more often than if nobody is looking." She looked at him for a long time in the dark. The specific quality of someone who has spent 14 years alone in something and is currently deciding, carefully and without rushing, what it would mean to not be alone in it anymore. "Okay?" she said. "Yes." He nodded. He was about to move away from the doorway when she said, "Ronan." He stopped. "The thing my father said about Daniel." She held his gaze. "About things you didn't know. Do you want to know if there's anything in the documentation that touches on it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Not tonight." "Okay. Maybe not ever." He looked at the wall. "What I know is what I know. Who took him and why and who gave the order. I've had that for 7 years. I don't know that adding to it changes anything important." "It might." "It might." He acknowledged it. "I'll tell you when I'm ready to look." He met her eyes. "Will you tell me if you come across something I should know?" She held his gaze. "Yes." "Okay." He straightened from the doorframe. "Try to sleep." "You too." He went back to the kitchen table. He sat for another hour. Then he moved to the couch in the main room and lay down and looked at the ceiling where the plane tree shadows moved in slow patterns that had no urgency in them whatsoever. And he was asleep before he'd decided to be, which was the most honest sleep he'd had in longer than he could accurately name. He woke at 7. The apartment was quiet, but he could hear, from the kitchen, the specific sounds of someone who had been up for a while moving with the contained efficiency of someone else's kitchen. The careful opening of cabinets, the deliberate setting of things on counters, the particular restrained noise of a person trying not to wake a person who is asleep in the adjacent room. He lay for a moment and listened to those sounds and felt something specific and simple move through him. Not the complicated freight of the last 6 days, but something underneath all of it that had been present in small ways since the first night in the penthouse, and had been getting less small with every day since. Something that didn't require a name to be real. He got up. She was at the kitchen counter and she had found coffee and figured out the machine, which was not an intuitive machine, a relic from a decade ago that required a specific sequence nobody had ever written down. And she was pouring 2 cups when he came in. She didn't comment on his sleeping on the couch. He didn't comment on her being awake for what was clearly several hours. She pushed one of the cups across the counter. He took it. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen counter in the morning light that came through the window over the sink. The specific thin, clear light of a morning after weeks of rain, the kind that found everything and showed it as it actually was without the softening of cloud cover, and drank coffee in silence. "Braddock," she said. 9 a.m. 10. He looked at the window. "I pushed it." "Why?" "Because there's something I need to do first." He took his coffee and went to the window that looked onto the street with the plane trees. The street was beginning its morning, a woman walking a dog, a delivery vehicle at the far end, 2 men talking outside the building across the way with the body language of people catching up before the day separated them. Ordinary, unremarkable, the specific texture of a city going about its business without awareness of what had happened inside the Meridian Tower the previous evening. By this afternoon it would know. The story was already out. Had been out since 11 minutes of audio had been simultaneously delivered to 300 phones in a Blackwater City ballroom. It was moving through networks now the way these things moved. Rapid, fragmenting, reaching people who would react in every possible direction. Reforming in the coverage of outlets that would be contacted and then filing stories through the night while Magnus Vale was being processed through federal intake, and his legal team was making calls, and the prosecutors Ferris had named were consulting their own lawyers, and the politicians in that ballroom were issuing carefully worded statements that were already being cross-referenced against the recordings by people who did that kind of work. The city was going to come apart in specific ways over the next several months. That was going to be real and sustained and difficult. And the people who had been depending on the structure that was now being excavated were going to respond in ways that were not all predictable and not all peaceful, and the federal proceedings were going to be long and expensive and occasionally maddening, and the foundation he was building in his head was going to hit every obstacle that underfunded organizations hitting structural injustice always hit, and some of the 23 names were going to end in the worst possible way. He held all of that clearly. And he also held with equal clarity the way the light was coming through the plane tree leaves this morning, and the sound of coffee being made in a kitchen by someone who was still here, and the specific feeling in his chest that was new enough to still have an edge to it, and which he had decided, sometime in the small hours of the night, not to set aside or defer or convert into something more manageable. He heard her footsteps behind him. She came and stood beside him at the window. The street was fully awake now that the deliveries and the dog walkers and the early commuters, the ordinary operations of a city morning proceeding with the indifference to drama that ordinary mornings had. "I need to go back to the penthouse at some point," she said. "I left things." "We can go today." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about Petra, whether she's protected. After last night, she's identifiable as part of the operation. She's already in the system. Braddock's team has her as a cooperating witness. She has protection for the duration of the proceedings." He paused. She and her sister, both. Selene looked at the street. "You moved fast on that." "I moved fast on several things last night." He looked at her profile. "Including one thing I should tell you about." She turned to look at him. "The man in Caracas," he said. "The one who was involved in Daniel's death." Her expression was careful. "I made a call last night," Ronan said, "before we left the federal building. He's been picked up by Interpol on existing warrants. He'll be extradited. He'll be tried." He paused. "Not by me. Through the actual process." She held his gaze. "That's—" She stopped. Started again. That's different from what you said you were planning. I know. He looked at the street. I was planning something else for 7 years. Last night, I planned something different. He was quiet for a moment. It felt more like justice than what I had before. I don't fully understand why. She looked at him for a long time in the morning light. I think, she said carefully, that it's because justice is actually what you wanted. What you were calling revenge was just the shape justice took when you had no other way to reach it. He looked at her. That's probably right, he said. She looked back at the street. Below them, a child was crossing with a school bag, moving at the particular pace of a child who hasn't yet learned to move at adult speeds, who still occupies each step as its own complete event. A woman called from a doorway, and the child looked up and changed direction without urgency. I want to stay, Selene said. The words came out carefully, like someone placing weight on ice and monitoring whether it holds. In Blackwater, I want to build the foundation. I want to do the work. She paused. I'm not asking you to... I know what you're asking, he said, and what you're not asking. She was quiet. I'm asking you to stay too, he said, in whatever form makes sense, at whatever pace. He turned to look at her. I'm not in a hurry. I've been in a hurry for 7 years. I'm done being in a hurry. She looked at him. The morning light found every line of her face, the exhaustion and the composure and the thing underneath both of them. That was neither. The thing that 14 years of sustained and deliberate survival had built in a person who had decided, somewhere in the darkest part of those years, that survival was not enough, and that she would live long enough to do something with it. She was 30 years old, and she had done something with it. She was standing in a kitchen window in the morning light of the day after, and Ronan Vey was standing beside her, and the city below them was going to be different from what it had been, and neither of them was the person they had been 6 days ago, and some of that was loss, and some of it was not loss at all. Okay, she said. Just that. Just the word. But she said it the way she said things that she meant absolutely. The way she'd said the 23 names on the legal pad, and the way she'd said, I know, when he told her about the man in Caracas, with the specific weight of a person whose words had been calibrated by years of having to mean exactly what they said, no more and no less. Weeks passed. The proceedings were long and unglamorous and exhausting in the specific way that legal processes are exhausting. Not the sharp drama of a single night, but the sustained grinding work of documentation and deposition and cross-examination, and the daily management of a story that was being told in courts and courtrooms, and in the coverage of outlets that had been calling the Vey attorney's office every day since the morning after the gala. Magnus Vale's preliminary hearings were attended by press in numbers that the federal court building had not seen in a decade. The recordings, already distributed beyond any possible containment, were verified and admitted. The trafficking operation documentation went to a specialized federal team, and the investigation it generated began reaching into jurisdictions beyond Blackwater City within 3 weeks. 3 politicians resigned. The prosecutor was indicted on a separate track. Ferris cooperated fully and was sentenced with the cooperation credit that full cooperation produced. Castellano did not appear in any formal proceeding. What he gave Braddock's team went into the federal record without attribution in the specific way that the federal system occasionally permitted when the information's value exceeded the value of the name attached to it. He moved out of Blackwater City in the 4th week. Ronan did not contact him. He did not contact Ronan. The conversation between Ronan and Crane happened on the 3rd day as promised, in the staging location before it was fully wound down. It was long and it was difficult, and it did not produce resolution in the clean sense of a conflict resolved. What it produced was an accounting, honest, without defensive softening on either side, and a working arrangement going forward that was smaller and more conditional than what had existed before, and which both men understood was the best version of the available options. Harlan Voss's bar reinstatement moved through the process with the specific acceleration that occurs when a fabricated complaint becomes part of a public evidentiary record. He was reinstated in the 8th week. He began consulting on the Foundation's legal architecture the following week, working from an office in the Harbor District 3 blocks from where he'd spent 20 years practicing before Magnus had ended that. He came to the work with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for a second act and has discovered that the second act is more real than the first. Petra's sister's name was Mara. She came to the Foundation's office in the 5th week, not to receive services, she said. She had been receiving services from the nonprofit in the Harbor District for a year. She came because she wanted to see the legal pad. She'd heard about it in conversation, the handwritten document with 23 names. She asked Selene if she could look at it. Selene gave it to her. Mara read every name. She pointed to 2 of them and said she knew these women, had known them, had been with them in the period before their disappearance, had reported their disappearance to authorities who had received the report and done nothing with it. After that, Mara stayed. She came in every day. She had a specific kind of knowledge about the V7 routes that existed only in the memories of survivors who had been through them, and she communicated it without flinching and without performance, with the specific matter-of-fact quality of someone who had decided that what happened to them was information that belonged to the effort of preventing it happening to others, and she was going to give it accordingly. Selene worked beside her. Ronan came in the evening sometimes and looked at what was being built, and contributed where he was asked and did not override, and did not redirect and did not attempt to manage what he had offered to stand beside rather than lead. He met with Braddock on the 10th day, as arranged, with his legal representation and 6 months of preparation compressed into 3 hours of frank disclosure. The meeting produced a framework. The framework was implemented over the following weeks. The organization that emerged from the implementation was smaller and different, and in several specific ways more honest than what had preceded it. And some of the men who had served it for a decade moved on to other arrangements, and some stayed. And the ones who stayed understood what they were staying for in a way that had not previously required articulation. He thought about Daniel. He thought about him differently now. Not the specific laser of grief kept usable by the conversion into operational purpose, but the full and complicated person of a younger brother who had wanted to design buildings that cared about light. He found, over weeks, that he could think about Daniel without the thought immediately becoming the machinery of the 7-year plan. He could just think about him. The laugh he'd had that was bigger than expected from someone his size. The way he'd argued about aesthetics with the conviction of someone who had strong opinions and no patience for the position that strong opinions about aesthetics were optional. The fact that he'd called Ronan 3 days before he died to talk about a project he was excited about, and that Ronan had cut the call short because he had operational matters that seemed more pressing. He could think about that now without converting the guilt into something actionable. He just sat with it. That was harder than the 7-year plan had been, and more honest, and he was doing it. The man from Caracas was extradited in the 9th week. The extradition proceedings were covered by 2 journalists who had been following the Blackwater story since the gala, and who wrote about the connection to the Vey family with the careful, factual attention of journalists who understood the complexity of the narrative they were in the middle of. Ronan read their coverage and found it accurate and did not contact them to provide additional context. He told Selene about the extradition the night it happened. They were in the West Quarter apartment. It had become where they mostly were, the penthouse used only when necessity required. The West Quarter apartment having accumulated, over weeks, the specific quality of a place where people actually lived rather than a place where people of means maintained a presence. She listened to what he said about the extradition, and then she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "How does it feel?" He thought about it honestly. Like the right thing is happening in the right way. He paused. Not satisfying in the way I expected it to be for 7 years, but correct. It feels correct. She looked at him. That's better than satisfied. I think so too. Magnus Vale's first major hearing was in the 11th week. Selene did not attend. This was her decision, made weeks before the date, communicated to Ronan with the flat certainty of someone who had thought it through from every angle. I've given everything I'm going to give to that proceeding, she said. My statement is in the record. My documentation is in evidence. My testimony is done. She looked at him. I don't need to sit in a room and watch it happen. I've been watching it happen in my head since I was 16 years old. The actual version doesn't need my attendance to be real. He did not attend either. They were at the Foundation that morning, a space in the Harbor District that Ronan had arranged, 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a building that had the unglamorous practicality of somewhere that was actually doing work rather than representing the idea of work. Voss had his corner. The research files occupied the back room. The front room was where people came when they came, which was happening with increasing frequency as the network Mara was building through her connections in the survivor community grew. They were in the front room when the hearing started, and they were still in the front room when a notification on Selene's phone indicated that the preliminary finding had been delivered. She looked at the notification. She put the phone face down on the desk. She continued what she was doing. Ronan watched her do this and felt, in the watching, something that he recognized belatedly as the specific feeling of being in the presence of a person whose wholeness you trusted. Not the absence of damage, not the pretense that 14 years had left her unmarked, but the specific integrity of someone who had integrated the damage rather than being defined by it, who was larger than what had happened to them. He turned back to his own work. Outside the harbor district windows, Blackwater City went about its business. The ships and the trucks and the traffic and the ordinary motion of a place with a complicated history working its way through another day of that history, neither innocent nor without hope, carrying what it carried and continuing to move. In the months that followed, there were days that were difficult, and days that were less difficult, and occasional days that were briefly something else, something in the register of ordinary life, the specific, unremarkable quality of two people eating dinner and arguing about something small, and laughing about something else, and sitting in the same silence in the evening the way people who have chosen to be in each other's lives eventually learn to sit. She still scanned rooms. He still read faces the way other men read text. Some habits were not remade. Some things that had been built by the years they'd each had could not be unbuilt entirely and were not supposed to be. They were both, as she had said once in a kitchen at 2 a.m, finding out what they looked like on the other side. And it was a process without a completion date, and neither of them expected one. The scars on her body remained. She never explained them to anyone who didn't already know, and she didn't require explanation from others about why they noticed. One morning in the West Quarter apartment, she was standing at the bathroom mirror looking at her own shoulder. The burn scar, the one he'd seen first, on the night that had changed everything. With an expression he caught in the reflection before she knew he was in the doorway. Not anguish. Not the look of someone in active pain. The look of someone taking an honest inventory. Looking at something real and letting it be real. She saw his reflection. Neither of them said anything. She turned away from the mirror and he stepped back from the doorway, and they went about the morning. That was the whole of it. That was what life looked like. Not the dramatic compression of a single night, but the long, unglamorous work of two people carrying what they carried and choosing, day by day, to carry it in proximity rather than alone. 6 months after the gala, on a quiet evening when the harbor light was coming in at the angle it came in the late summer in Blackwater City, low and gold and catching the water in a way that made the port look briefly like a painting of itself, Selene was standing on the small balcony of the West Quarter apartment, watching the light change on the water. Ronan came and stood beside her. Below them, the street was the street it always was. The harbor was the harbor. The city was the city, different in specific ways from what it had been 6 months ago, the same in more ways than the different, because cities were like that. Because even the most significant excavations of a city's structure left its surface largely intact and its people continuing to be what they were, which was complicated and damaged and capable and unremarkable and occasionally surprising in ways that sustained whatever hope existed. They stood for a while without talking. She had her arms loosely crossed and her eyes on the water, and the light was finding the specific planes of her face that the light in that hour found, and she looked, Ronan thought, like a person who was present in the moment she was in. Not performing presence, not the performed composure of the woman who had walked into a wedding 6 months ago like she was walking into a sentence she'd been given. Actually, here. Actually, in this specific evening. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked at the harbor for a moment. "Daniel would have had something specific to say about this building," he said, "architecturally. He would have pointed out something about the proportion of the windows to the facade that was either very right or very wrong, and he would have had strong feelings about which." She looked at him. "He sounds like he was exhausting," she said. "Incredibly." Ronan paused. "I miss him every day." She didn't offer words for that. She had understood over months that some things he said were not invitations for response, but simply the act of saying them. The thing that the 7-year project had prevented, and which was now, in the absence of the project, possible. She just stayed beside him and let the saying of it be real. After a while, she said, "What, Lev?" He looked at her. "We found him." She kept her eyes on the water. Mara's contact tracked him through the network. He's in the Eastport district. He has an apartment. His daughter is in school 3 blocks from it. She paused. "He doesn't know I know where he is." "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want to go see him." She turned to look at Ronan. "I want to tell him that it worked, that the thing he left the door unlocked for, twice, at enormous risk, with a daughter who needed him alive, I want him to know it worked." Ronan looked at her. "Then we go see him," he said. She turned back to the harbor. The light was changing the way light does when the evening gets serious about becoming night. The gold going out of it, the blue coming in, the water taking on the specific deep color that the harbor had in the hour before dark. The ships at the port were lit already. The city was lighting up, building by building, the ordinary nightly act of a place switching itself on for the dark hours. Selene watched it and breathed and was here. Ronan watched her watching it. The city below them was not innocent. It had never been innocent. It was what cities were. The accumulated consequence of every decision made inside it, good and corrupted and ordinary and extraordinary, all of it leaving its mark on the physical fact of the place, all of it continuing forward into the next version of what the place would be. Tonight's version was different from last year's version, and last year's version had been different from the year before that. And the difference was not always progress in the clean sense, and was not always disaster either. It was just the city, continuing, which was what they were doing too. He looked at her profile in the last of the harbor light. The woman who had walked into a room 6 months ago carrying 14 years of damage and 14 years of preparation and the specific unbreakable quality of someone who had decided, in the darkest part of the worst years, that she would survive long enough to do something with the surviving, and felt the weight of what was in his chest settle into something he could carry without converting it into something else, without making it useful, without turning it into a plan. He could just carry it. That was new. He was still learning what new felt like. She turned and looked at him, and whatever she found in his face, she looked at it directly, the way she looked at everything, without evasion, without performance, with the honest attention of someone who had learned that the only things worth seeing were the ones you were willing to see clearly. "Okay," she said. One word. The word she used when she meant something completely. Below them, Blackwater City spread outward to its edges. The harbor and the port and the old neighborhoods and the towers and the streets and all the ordinary and extraordinary lives being lived inside its structure. And the night came down over it with the indifferent evenness of nights everywhere, and the lights on the water were clean and still, and neither of them had anything left to prove to it or to each other or to the versions of themselves they'd been before this. They had only what was here, and what was here was enough.